wanted to listen to philosophy. Nathan Hawkins, let's go. I'll play Warhammer as well. Yeah, the campaign is getting a bit sluggish. I need to listen to something. And my cat is hacking the system, pressing buttons. Anyway. Why are you pressing all of those buttons? Can't you press like numpad instead? Anyway, yay, got out the full screen Firefox. Can I even do this? Why?
As I mentioned,
doing this from the beginning.
Right now in the Western world, we are living in a time where society is fracturing. This increased polarization is often called the culture wars. But culture
haven't heard that one before.
Because they are not about culture at all, nor are they about political hot topics like gender or free speech.
Nothing is about
These
culture.
are just the symptoms of an underlying conflict between two radically opposed ways of making sense of the world. Both these worldviews developed in the late 19th and early 20th century in response to what Nietzsche called the death of God cultural event. They are basically two ways of intellectually making sense of atheism. And once
also,
you
Evangelion is about death of God. I will make a video out of it soon.
Of what's really going on in Western culture. But who's this guy to be talking about these things? Well, I'm a philosopher affiliated with Cambridge University, where I currently teach, lecture and supervise students. My PhD thesis was sponsored by Bill Gates and was on the views of a prominent
evil guy,
of the late
such
19th
evilness.
Century.
Of course,
I've since turned my thesis into an academic book, which will be published later this year. What I discovered during my research really helped me make sense of the intellectual situation we find ourselves in. So I decided to make this video to help people understand what on earth is going on out there. Now, I'm not saying what I'm about to tell you is the only way to make sense of things.
But it is.
Nothing is ever that simple. But there are lots of
No, if
factors at
it's
play,
not so simple, how can I
and
feel
generally
good?
unnoticed element of the picture. And to my mind, it's the most important one, because it opens up the possibility of a solution to the crisis. For the death of God didn't give rise to only two conflicting worldviews, it actually gave rise to three. But the one that began the strongest eventually
should
gave
this
way
guy maybe
and
move here?
disappeared.
So he could
Philosophers now
possibly
examining
defend
this
against, I don't know, something.
that the failure of this radically alternative school of thought wasn't due to any intellectual fault in its reasoning, but merely a result of an unfortunate series of events. In my view, this alternative way of thinking needs to be restored and taken very seriously, especially since one of its leading thinkers saw precisely where we were headed and tried to warn us. More on that.
They tried to warn us. We didn't listen.
And I'll get onto how issues of free speech and gender are related as well. So
oh no, he's talking about gender.
But as I mentioned at the beginning, you first need to understand the current situation, and that requires looking at the history of Western thought to understand why the death of God occurred when it did, and just how much of a genuine intellectual bombshell
because
it
God
really
got
was.
old.
Only then can you understand the context in which the two opposing worldviews arose.
God was
and
hella
why they
old,
take
like
the intellectual and political
couple of
positions
millennia.
they do. Then, finally, I can introduce you to the third way of thinking and
Third
why
way?
it is so important.
I only want
So
one
here's what
way.
you can expect from this video. There will be 7 sections, and they are each important, so don't skip ahead.
7 sections.
Section 1 will give a very quick overview of the history of thought from medieval times up until the 19th century, focusing on a few key figures that are particularly relevant for our concerns. Section 2 will then explain what happened to cause the death of God in that century, and how our existing paradigms were utterly shattered. Section 3 will then introduce and discuss one of the responses to this crisis, which forms one team in the culture wars, a response I'm calling scientism. I will outline some of its history,
Let's
its
just
key
give them money.
doctrines, and why it is inadequate. Section 4 then turns to an
2K
alternative way of
now.
responding to the death of God, which I am calling subjectivism. which comprises the opposing team in the culture wars. As with scientism, I will explore some of its history, key thinkers and ideas, and some criticisms that have been made of it. Section 5
Say I'm a
presents these
friend, but you
worldviews
don't
at
agree with
war
anything.
by looking at how they differently approach the political issues of gender and free speech. This should help you understand why there is so much miscommunication surrounding the flashpoints of our public debates. Section 6 then gives a short argument for why, as things stand, subjectivism and progressive politics will eventually win. And I also explain the almost prophetic understanding of our current situation that was put forward by the philosopher R.G. Collingwood
€1,000
in the early 20th century and why it
or
relates to
gold
philosophy.
nuggets.
Lastly, but most importantly, Section
sure.
7 will outline another historical response to the death of God that can and should be revived to
I
provide
like
a
that the vampire said
much-needed
mayhap.
new and radical understanding
Cool.
of the world. Stick around for this because it will blow your mind and offer something inspiring and insightful to live by. But you can't go there until you
Lol.
understand
Everyone
the
dead has
background
come
or
back.
really what
We're
it
the
is.
undead.
Just before I get going, if deep philosophical ideas are your thing, please subscribe
Oh,
for
I'm
more
very
great
deep.
free content and consider joining my mailing list below for information on other opportunities to engage with me and the work that I'm doing. Thanks. Let's go.
You're welcome.
Imagine a medieval monk trying to make sense of the universe.
Medieval.
What
I
he knows
haven't
of
heard
experiences of the world
anyone
is
say it
pretty
like that.
limited. So how is he supposed to get a view of the whole of reality to understand it? Fortunately, he has an ultimate perspective to draw from: God's. God knows everything because he is eternal, transcendent, and he created it all according to his plan. And God decided to reveal these deep truths through the Bible and
should
other
we
forms of
demolish this?
revelation. So the monk's knowledge of things is primarily
Maybe.
drawn from sacred writings and the words of those recognized to have spiritual
I mean,
insight.
this doesn't have
In
any
the later
value
medieval
unless
period, ancient
we
Greek
put in
philosophy
the
began recirculating,
other thing.
especially the
Yeah.
works of Aristotle. Aristotle's view was that humans are special in their capacity to reason, both intellectually and morally. Reason was then interpreted as the gift humans received from God when he made us in his image, and so reason was also a path to understanding. The use of reason to gain knowledge became known as natural philosophy.
But what if
which
I'm
at that time was done in
unreasonable?
accordance with both Christian doctrine and the works of Aristotle. Aristotle understood the natural world in terms of the purposes of things. So if you wanted to understand what, say, an acorn was, you had to understand it in terms of the oak tree it was planted to
Kurgazan. Oh yeah, this was
Thinking
taken
about
from me,
things in
that's
terms
why.
of their purposes was thought to be closely aligned to the Christian outlook that saw the world as the work of a designer. This way of thinking, called scholasticism, was at its peak in the 14th and
Why can't they build
15th
this?
centuries.
Why?
Let's skip forward now
Ah,
to
it's
Francis
building
Bacon,
on the space.
an
Oh,
English
yeah.
philosopher living from 1561 to 1626. By this time, natural philosophy had turned its attention to examinations of the natural world, and Aristotle's scientific
Meh.
dominance had come under pressure from various directions. Bacon's principal contribution was a change of method. He rejected Aristotle's explanations based on the purposes of things and instead drew on earlier Greek philosophers who understood reality as comprised of atoms behaving in predictable, law-like ways.
Should we do
From this,
Slayer
Bacon proposed a method of
upgrades?
scientific knowledge
That
based
will
on
take a couple of turns.
experiment. Bacon thought
Whatevs.
we first need to observe the world, experiment on it, and then come up with testable theories
Yeah,
that
his
can
name is
explain the
Bacon.
observed data. These are the roots of what is called an inductive approach to knowledge, as opposed to the deductive one we get in logic and mathematics. The emphasis is on what we can
Guess
see
these guys
and
can stay?
observe, and less
I don't
on
know.
universal principles that present themselves to our reason. And it is important to note what a shift it was. Bacon's method doesn't rely
Bacon.
merely on reason to gain knowledge, but on reason and the results of carefully selected observations we get from our senses. This change of approach paved the way for the modern scientific method in all its fruitfulness. Now, it should be noted that Bacon was no atheist. His idea of knowledge acquisition was aligned with a Christian worldview. He distinguished between what he called the Book of God and the Book of Nature. The Book of God concerned God's will for the world, which was outside of our human capacity to understand, while the Book of Nature concerned God's work in creation. And Bacon believed our attempt to understand God's creation was an act of divine Christian service. By discovering the divine order hidden in creation, Bacon thought we could use this new understanding to relieve, through technology, the suffering of God's children after the curse of the fall. For Bacon, doing science is part of our way of participating in the redemptive work of God on the earth. While Bacon was experimenting in England, a contemporary of his, Galileo Galilei, who lived from 1564 to 1642, was pioneering another kind of science, one based on mathematics and a mechanistic conception of the universe. Like Bacon, Galileo also rejected Aristotle's view of the world.
Let's do
focus was on Aristotle's cosmology, which taught that the Earth was at the center of the universe and was comprised of 4 elements: earth, water, air, and fire. Galileo instead promoted the theory of Copernicus, that had the sun at the center rather than the earth. And he believed there was only one fundamental substance, which was matter. In 1632, he published a book
I can only hype global,
the 2 chief world systems that attacked the Aristotelian view
just in case.
and defended the Copernican position. He also tried to explain, using a combination of mathematics and experiment, how Aristotle's 4 elements could each be kinds of the one element of matter. Like Bacon, Galileo explained the coherence of his scientific view with Christianity by distinguishing between 2 kinds of truths. First, there were the historical and spiritual truths of Scripture, and second, there were the observable and rational truths of the natural world. Galileo believed that the truths of these 2 kinds were entirely harmonious, so any conflicts that arose were due to errors of interpretation, either of Scripture or of our sense experience. Of course, Galileo is probably most famous for his encounter with the Catholic Inquisition in 1633, the year after he published his Copernican
This is moderate, come on.
Dialogue. The simplistic account that the church saw his theories as a threat to their power, so put him under house arrest, is highly contested and almost certainly not the full story. Regardless, the emerging changes in how he made sense of the natural world, moving away from Aristotle's emphasis on purposes towards one which was primarily mechanical,
be like that, Carl Franz, be like that. What did I need actually?
Of the Christian worldview.
Defensive or military.
Didn't determine which is the greater truth when there appear to be clashes. An alternative way of harmonizing science with Christian teaching was provided by another philosopher of that time, René Descartes, who lived from 1596 to 1650. Descartes argued that there were 2 fundamentally different substances, a position called dualism. There was mind and there was matter.
This philosopher is going about it in a bit too roundabout way. You can directly talk about Nietzsche without going into like Descartes.
He believed interactions between these substances. The distinction provided a neat way to separate the primary realm of religious knowledge from that of scientific knowledge. Natural science dealt with the realm of matter in space, whereas religion was chiefly concerned with the transcendent realm of the immaterial soul and spirits. The period just described is called the early modern period, and it led to a split into 2 different schools of thought: empiricism and rationalism. Descartes, a Frenchman, was a rationalist.
Ackendorf?
Rationalists believe that the foundation of knowledge is to be found in human reason. So they emphasize the truths found in logic and mathematics, which they take to be self-evident. The validity of the observed world of experience,
so they'll just pop up on the map, right?
Argument. Typically, this self-evident knowledge is thought to be innate to the human mind for rationalists. The implantation of God as part of our rational nature.
Guess we can
For
defend with these
example, we
guys.
seem to just know that every object must be identical to itself. And we know that without having to go out into the world and check to see if it's true. It's these kinds of truths that rationalists like Descartes and Gottfried Leibniz focus on. On the other hand, empiricists like the Englishman John Locke of 1632 to 1704 believe humans are born as blank slates with neither intrinsic concepts nor knowledge of the world. All human knowledge and our conceptual apparatus was,
Level
he thought,
7?
gained
Sure.
through our experience of the world. Thus it is experience that provides the foundation of all human understanding, rather
Yeah,
than
let's do
reason.
that.
Locke also provides the philosophical basis for taking a rather specific view towards science, which is called realism.
Cheapest,
Remember,
bestest.
Bacon thought that scientific
Good
inquiry was our way
quarrelers.
of trying to understand the ways and principles of God that he hid within his creation. It was ultimately a tool we could use to help people and alleviate suffering. But John Locke thought science was something more than that. He thought that it was a way to somehow transcend our limited experience of the world to get a view of its true essential nature. Now, it can be hard for us to see how much of a genuinely radical idea this is, because it is something we now often just take for granted. But bear with me here and try to see its radical nature. Science, according to Locke, revealed the true nature of reality. The entities and properties it uses to explain phenomena were, he argued, the entities and properties there really were. Entities and properties that did not fit within the scientific explanation of things were mere products of the way things appear to our minds. They were not, in a sense, real. Now, the science of Locke's day was a little before Newton and was based on a theory called corpuscularian theory, which is similar to the atomic theory that came later. So, corpuscles are a bit like atoms. And this theory explained
sure.
all phenomena in terms of structures and movements of these corpuscles, their size, shape, location, and motion. Locke thought that this stripped down inventory of what there is and its properties revealed the truth about the stripped down nature of reality. So he divided the rich world of our sensory experience
What? Punter?
into qualities of two types.
What?
Primary qualities
What's
and
wrong with grammar?
secondary qualities. The primary
Light
qualities
water,
were those associated with the corpuscularian science. These were size, shape, location, and the movement of things that we experience.
I mean,
Locke thought
we can just
this is
take
how
these
things
guys there.
really are. Whereas other features of our
Soon.
experience, like colour, sound, textures, tastes and smells, were secondary aspects. They were not part of reality, but only arose in our mind through a causal process that involved corpuscles, their primary qualities, our sense organs, and an experiencing mind. So for Locke, the tree I see in my garden really
Demolish.
is tree-shaped, really is swaying in the wind, and really is located in my garden. But its leaves aren't really green, nor do its apples really taste sweet, or really make a crunch sound when you bite them. So for Locke, in reality, there is no music or poetry, just sound waves. No sweetness and bitterness, just molecules of various shapes. Nothing is soft or coarse, there are just structures with more or less resistance to them. With the stroke of a pen, much of our conscious experience was dismissed as illusory and mind-dependent. And science was crowned king, capable in theory of granting us a transcendent God's eye view of reality. I've done another video dealing with this idea a bit more, which I've linked in the card above me and in the description. So check that out for more about Locke.
I think we can handle anything that
Now, Locke
comes
was
our
a
way.
Christian and a dualist. He admitted the reality of the experiencing mind.
Win the
which he
following
thought
battle,
was
Dragon
outside
Crown
the
of
observable
Paras.
material world that science describes. So in Locke's view, there
The
was
war
still
approaches.
space for the insights of religion. But his shift towards scientific realism paved the way for a view called materialism, which rejects the mental realm altogether and thinks that everything that exists is material. In which case, the only reality there is the one described by science. This position would later come to dominate. While Locke was still living, Isaac Newton came along and solidified the place of science as the key to understanding nature. In 1687, Newton wrote his magnum opus, Philosophiae Naturalis Principia Mathematica, which translates to Mathematical Principles of Natural Philosophy. This incredible work systematized the observable phenomena both in the skies and on the earth into an elegant mathematical model. Hence, classical physics, with its mechanistic principles, was indisputable. But God was not squeezed out yet, not by a long shot. In fact, the understanding of classical science at the time was infused with theistic thinking. Physics may have been thought to rest on mathematics and universal physical laws, but mathematics and universal physical laws were firmly believed to rest on the mind and divine authority of God. And Newton himself seemed to have believed his work would act as evidence for a divine creator.
So much skin.
When I wrote my treatise
Contract
about our
ready.
system, I had an eye upon such principles as might work with considering men for the belief of a deity. And nothing can rejoice me more than to find it useful for that purpose. Not only was God understood to be the divine authority behind the mechanistic laws, the two truths understanding still asserted that religion and scripture gave us knowledge concerning history and things of an eternal nature. Christianity, not science, explained how the world began.
So many rebels, so many forces.
To be outside nature, such as the human condition, the afterlife, the mind, reason itself, morality, and the meaning of life. In addition, since God knew all things, he acted as a guarantee that there were ultimate truths. What was true was what God believed and said. It was absolute. He could not be in error, and any that thought differently to God was simply wrong. And since he was our Father, we were fashioned in his image as his children. This meant we possessed, in limited form, a mind like God's, capable in principle of understanding the intellect that orders the universe. The foregoing has been very brief, but we now have enough understanding to turn to the all-important 19th century and look at the death of God event. It was this event that
we could just be defensive here. I don't know.
Two worldviews
just
that
in
are
case.
currently at war in our culture. To understand the felt catastrophe that was the death of God, I want you to get a feel for how people in Britain, the empire of the time, made sense of things just before it hit. Because unless you can imagine yourself in their position, you will have no genuine understanding of the sheer earth-shattering devastation that occurred. In the 19th century, Britain was extremely religious and predominantly evangelical, partly due to the preaching by the likes of John Wesley and George Whitefield in the century before. Most Victorian children attended Sunday school and were likely to have heard over 1,000 sermons before adulthood. Evangelicals were heavily involved in politics and drove several changes in Victorian law.
Ambush? No, 25% movement range.
Also, evangelical pamphlets and sermons were hugely popular. The Victorian preacher Charles Spurgeon sold 50 million copies of his sermons within his lifetime. To put that in perspective, the population of Britain was then only around 30 million people.
It's a funny name.
Per capita, that made his writings even more popular than those of J.K. Rowling today. Evangelicals believed the Bible to be literally and historically true, and it was very important to Victorians since it provided them with faith, hope, and meaning. It taught that our earthly life would be followed by eternal life in heaven, and that our actions in this world would all be judged by God, resulting in punishment or reward. This meant that justice would eventually be fully achieved, and every act was meaningful because every act had eternal significance. There were, of course, many evangelical academics too, and as we have seen, a historical and literal reading of the Bible fit comfortably with the existing science under a two truths or two substances view. But trouble was brewing, and it would hit the academics
cannot colonize ruins of this racial type. Ugh.
The first wave was geological. It was discovered that the observable geological features require long timescales to develop. These long timescales conflicted with the date of creation given in the Bible. A second geological discovery came in the fossil record that showed many early species, such as dinosaurs, have gone extinct. This was very difficult to fit with the biblical account of Noah's flood, where God instructed Noah to preserve all animal species.
What's Sir Kurgan there? Deadly
One
onslaught, let's
prominent
go!
Victorian academic, John Ruskin, who later renounced his evangelicalism, remarked, "If only the geologists would let me alone, I could do quite well. But those dreadful hammers, I hear the clink of them at the end of every cadence of the Bible verses."
Ooh,
A
there's
second wave
lots
that
of armies
undermined the
here.
authority of the Bible came not from science, but a new form of textual criticism. Rather than just studying the content of what was written in texts, academics began analysing them within the context of the biases of the author and the political and historical circumstances in which it was written.
Level
This
12,
new
level
mode of
10.
analysis was soon applied to the Bible,
Yeah.
and suggested it too was no exception. The Bible's contents also bore the mark of its human authors, which undermined the evangelicals' claim that the words it contained were divinely dictated. But if
Can't
these
move?
two waves are
Why?
damaging, the third was utterly devastating. In 1859, Charles Darwin published
What?
On the Origin of Species. in
Okay,
which he
it
presents
took
his
movement
theory
points to
of
move the
evolution.
armies back and
Darwin's
forth.
theory
Yeah,
not only
meh.
challenged a literal reading of the creation account in Genesis, it tore at the heart of the Christian understanding of human nature and our relationship with God and the
Okay,
world.
whatever.
Genesis describes humans as divine children, made in the image of God and placed in a perfect world. Humans were then said to have disobeyed God and fallen away from this perfect state into one of sin, suffering, and corruption. But Christianity taught that Jesus both did and will rescue us from this fallen state and return us to a state of bliss. The
Treaty,
Christian
yes.
account, therefore, is centered on the idea that we are naturally perfect, but corrupted creatures, capable of redemption. Evolution, on the other hand, describes us as animals that have slowly
What?
risen from a primitive and savage existence via a blood-soaked process of blind, survival-driven necessity. What we have and what we are has no connection with anything beyond the struggle to survive. And our faculties are
order,
the
blah,
weapons
blah,
of
blah.
war our evolutionary history has passed on
Map,
to us. According to
Karaksoren.
evolution, there is no state of perfection from which we have fallen.
Okay, why not?
Bliss does not and has never existed. How it is the best it has ever been for us. After this dramatic third wave crashed against the Christian worldview, a fourth quickly followed. Given that evolution stripped human bodies of their divine ancestry, it wasn't long before the same treatment was being given to the human mind, and psychology was born. Psychology undermined the idea that there was anything special about the human mind or its capacity to reason. There was no divine imprint here either. Psychology painted a picture of the human mind as one driven by subconscious urges, sexual impulses, desires, fears, jealousies, and a lust for power and domination.
Not necessarily
This
true,
was a
but
far cry
yeah.
from the ancient idea of the human mind put forward by Aristotle, where it is set apart from the mind of animals by its unique capacity for logical reasoning
Guess I
and
cannot
for moral judgment.
go here.
All four of these ways hit Western societies in the 19th century, and their
Yeah, I
effects
cannot
were
colonize.
intellectually
Meh.
devastating for the old paradigms. Near the end of the century, Nietzsche famously declared
to the
that
right.
God was
Okay.
now dead. What he meant by this was that Western belief in the Christian God had ended, and that it would no longer exert an influence on our understanding, culture, and values. Now, widespread Christian belief continued into the 20th century, but the two world wars brought home the feeling of being abandoned by God and the stark reality of needless suffering. Afterwards, the churches began to empty. From an intellectual standpoint, however, the old Christian understanding had been decisively shattered in the century before, and it seemed that something new built on different foundations was needed. As it happened, three intellectual responses rose up to begin with, two of which are currently at war, the third disappeared. So let's take a look at them now, starting with scientism. The crisis of faith, combined with an already established two truths conception, presented an obvious reply. If one of the two truths has been shown to be suspect, why not just do without it altogether? Science was not only untouched by these
Yeah, sure, pay
intellectual
us.
shifts, it was what had done the shifting. Its credentials were newly polished, and it seemed to have answered the question of which way to turn when conflict arose between these two kinds of truths. In simplified terms, this response to the death of God is what I will call scientism. It is the view that science is the foundation of all knowledge about reality, and it is closely associated with the materialism that arose from Locke's philosophical views about science. Such an account rejects the two truths view by saying there are only the truths of science, and it also rejects the two substances view, saying there is only matter.
Okay.
But taking this route
take them
is not
on.
straightforward. Under the old paradigm, God grounded the validity of our reason and gave us access to an objective perspective. Without God, there was a need to justify things like logic,
let's have fun.
mathematics, and even the universality of the laws of physics. Science relied on such things for its explanations, but they don't seem to be things that are material, nor can they be demonstrated by experiment or observation. Hence, much of the historical difficulties for scientism concern the issue of how to harmonize the process of knowledge acquisition, said to be made possible by science, with the narrow view of what there is that can be supported by it. A brief look at how these issues played out and where they ended up is very enlightening. Early on, evolutionary psychology presented a challenge to scientific knowledge along these lines. If we are just products of the need to survive,
good enough.
if the mind is not some
We
different
can immediately
substance,
attack Marauder
then our
Huntsman,
reason must
or
be a natural
Sutra
faculty
Egg.
that is
Sutra Egg
developed
is a good
simply
target.
to help us survive. In which case, it seems that our reasoning processes are just the same as other mental processes, and so logic is just psychology. This view was known as psychologism, and it was immediately identified as a threat to the objective claims of mathematical and logical truths that underpin science. Psychologism rejects the distinction between how we in fact think and how we ought to think. And since we in fact think in ways that are regularly governed by irrational desires and fears, and since we regularly make error-strewn inferences, there seems to be no way to establish the validity of logical or mathematical reasoning, which would undermine the special status of scientific explanation. The reaction to psychologism was retrospectively called the linguistic turn, and it formed the foundations of what has become known as analytic philosophy. The idea here is to point to what is common to thought, and to separate it from what is
missed shot
private,
is
subjective,
still a
and
shot.
merely psychological. What is common to thought was said to be that which is captured in a shared descriptive language. The idea is that since we can and do successfully communicate with one another, there must be something to the meaning of our words that is public. This shared meaning is therefore intersubjective. In other words,
is the guy trying to
shared among humans, and so
actively
beyond the private psychology
what is that?
of any one human. It would also be
Damage
natural to
resistance.
assume that this shared language is shared because it talks about our shared world. So analytic philosophy turned away from efforts
300
to reach
meters.
a transcendent God's eye view of reality and began to focus on linguistic meaning as a realm in which individual subjectivity was absent. Logic then became a science of what can be concluded from these public aspects of meaning. It was a matter of what propositions followed from what, and what the rules are that govern relations between meanings and concepts. And since language and
big fireball coming!
expressed, analysis of language
Nothing
became a
happened
tool
then.
whereby the structures of thought itself could be analysed and studied. Logical tools to analyse meanings were vigorously developed in this period, leading to huge advances in formal logic, eventually resulting in computers.
Go down,
One interpretation of what formal logic expresses, first presented by Wittgenstein in the Tractatus of 1921, became particularly appealing to this school of thought. It was the idea that logic was not concerned with the particular content of thought at all, but only with its formal structure. If that's the case, then logical
target
truths say
filter.
nothing at all about how the observed world is, and so it should not be expected that logical truths could be empirically tested by experiment. In other words, science can fully describe the observed world, while logic purely concerns the public structures of our thinking. These early years were also dominated by efforts to demonstrate that mathematics was reducible to logic, a view called logicism. This would mean that once logic had a secure footing, mathematics could follow it, and both could be deployed as part of a universal science of thought. Unfortunately, the project to reduce mathematics to logic failed due to the discovery of Russell's paradox, and the claims
that
of
actually
formal logic to
did some
capture human
damage.
thought were later undermined by Gödel's incompleteness theories. I'll do a video explaining these ideas later, so subscribe if that is of interest to you. Relatedly, there was an early 20th century movement called logical empiricism, sometimes called logical positivism. This movement sought to rid philosophy of anything that had even the slightest whiff of being unscientific. Clearly, this included theology, but it also included metaphysical claims about the nature of reality that were not based on what could be observed. Building on the idea that philosophy was focused on meaning, they argued for this conclusion by claiming that anything that could not be verified by observation was meaningless. This claim became known as the verification principle and was most famously presented by A.J. Ayer in 1936. Ayer said that a statement is meaningful if and only if we know how to verify
Why
the
can't we hit
proposition
those?
it purports to express.
Okay, not enough range, I
That
guess.
is, if we know what observations would lead us to accept the proposition as true or reject it as false. So disputes that can't be settled by observation, like theological claims about the Trinity or metaphysical claims about the nature of numbers, were deemed to be simply gibberish, and so not even wrong. There were, however, philosophical objections to the verificationist principle. The major one was that the verificationist principle, if it were true, would make itself meaningless, since there is no way of verifying it by observation. This meant that Ayer's fundamental claim was self-defeating. Another logical empiricist, Rudolf Carnap, tried to overcome this defect by introducing a principle of tolerance. The details of his position get very technical, but the basics are easy to understand. The idea is that verification can only happen within a language or theory that has its own internal methods of verification. These methods then give meaning to the sentences in that language or theory. For example, there are understood methods of proof in mathematics, and standards of evidence for establishing results in the sciences. It is these theory-specific methods of verification that provide meaning to the claims made within those disciplines. So, outside of a theory, there is no universal language that independently provides those theories with their meaning. The verification principle itself, then, is not a claim made within any particular language or theory, but something that guides the kinds of theories that can be considered scientific.
You go here.
Since the verification principle is something enacted but not expressed, it does not need to be verified and so is not rendered meaningless. Or so the idea goes. Non-scientific theories or modes of language are then tolerated, but because they are detached from the observable world, they are effectively useless. Theological and metaphysical language for Carnap would fall into the useless category. Of course, if you take that route, then you have a plurality of theories and meanings and truths, at least one for each of the sciences with distinct methodologies. So how can you compare the verifiable truths of one science, say physics, with the verifiable truths of another science, say biology? Strictly speaking, these sentences in those languages mean different things, even if they use the same words. This question split opinion for the logical empiricists. Some thought these sciences could and should all be unified into a grand theory of physics. The idea is that given enough understanding, biological claims, for example, could be translated into complex physical claims and verified according to the laws of physics. Perhaps, for example, talk of respiration could eventually be translated into talk of particles bouncing off each other in the right kind of way. In the end, all sciences would be seen as reducible, both linguistically
Guess
and
we can
in
target
essence,
these guys.
to physics.
Yeah.
Other logical empiricists were more liberal and were happy to let the sciences proliferate, as long as they were all guided by the verification principle and so properly scientific.
Not hitting our own guys, right? Right? Maybe?
Please. But other than that, there was no need to unify all the sciences. They all had their place. Carnap himself was on the liberal team. In 1948, W.V.O. Quine, a self-confessed disciple of Carnap, published a landmark article, On What There Is. In it he claimed that to be is to be the value of a variable. Again, technical details are not important, nor is the vexed question of exactly how Quine intended his dictum to be understood. But what is of interest is what his idea ended up affecting. For it provided a new way to do scientifically inspired metaphysics within analytic philosophy. The idea, put simply, is
Why
to
is this
get to
guy's
a
losing?
logical model of language, and then
Why?
you read off from that what exists by looking at the things that language talks about. If you
This
find
chase
you
is
need
the
to talk about
funniest thing
mathematical
ever.
Sets, colors, and possible words
Run.
in your model, then sets, numbers, and possible words exist. But if you find you can get by without talking about these things, then great. You don't need to commit to their existence. Basically, this was good old-fashioned scientific realism of the sort Locke put forward all those years ago. But this time it was applied to logical rather than scientific theories. Philosophy had its own method now, and it was like the one of the sciences.
Oh,
And
it's
so
only
philosophy
17
could
left.
take its place at that illustrious
Nah.
table alongside the physicists. I've
14
done a
left,
longer
what?
video on contemporary metaphysics and how it works, linked above me and in the description.
Why can't
Added to
you
this
fire?
was the concept
Obstructed?
of
What?
theory
Why?
choice. In 1962, Thomas Kuhn published The Structure of Scientific Revolutions, which showed convincingly that science doesn't progress slowly and steadily, piece by piece, but tends to go through periods of great progress, followed by stagnation, followed by revolution. Revolution occurred, he thought, when an existing scientific paradigm had accrued difficulties it couldn't
cool.
solve, and a new approach seemed to promise a richer and more powerful way of understanding things. But for a period, there would be some overlap, during which it was unclear which was the better theory. The crucial thing here is that there is no theory-independent way to decide which theory to go for, mainly because the standards of how competing claims are assessed can only be prescribed within a governing theory. So, when faced with a choice between competing theories, the decision must be made on grounds other than their verifiability or their truth. To work out what theory to adopt, the principles of theory choice say you should choose a theory based on its overall properties, such as simplicity, elegance, strength, and parsimony. In other words, all else being equal, pick the theory that is easier to apply, more aesthetically pleasing, able to explain the most, and doesn't say lots of different things or kinds of things exist. A principle called Occam's razor. Analytic philosophy
guy is
soon
way
copied these
too
methods and began comparing different
historical
logical
about
models
these
with each other
explanations.
on the same
You could have
basis.
just talked about the
Whoever
things
has
straight
the
away.
simplest, strongest, and most parsimonious logical model wins.
Parsimonious.
And you can then read off what exists from that theory. By this time, the days when science was called natural philosophy were long gone. Back then, science was merely a specialist branch of philosophy. Now it was philosophy that was trying its best to be a branch of science,
1914.
and the general public realized it, at least
Can we
in
get
passing.
at least a couple
If
down?
you wanted to know what reality was like, it was the
Yay,
physicists you
one
would
more
turn
other
to,
champion down.
not the philosophers. By the early 2000s, the scientific
One
worldview
more.
had gone mainstream
Poor
and
guy.
become culturally embedded. So it's pretty straightforward for the new atheist
Okay,
movement
I
to
think
make it official.
that's it for now.
There was no
Ooh,
longer
these
room for
these
religion,
guys
they said,
can be
because
routed
science
well.
could explain everything. The principle of tolerance be damned. Theism was irrational, superfluous, and downright silly. and besides being a big mistake, it was also dangerous and responsible for most of the world's problems. What I find quite interesting in this philosophical situation is that these days, even debates about whether God
let's
exists
optimize, let's
often
max
assume
the damage,
scientific
whatever, blah
methodology
blah blah.
to decide the argument. On the one hand, the
Oh,
atheist
can't
claims
really
that
get there
everything can
anymore.
be explained without appealing to the existence of God. And since we therefore don't need God as an entity in our theory of the world, it is better to choose the atheistic position for reasons of simplicity and parsimony. Whereas on the other hand, the theist tries to argue that any theory of reality that doesn't include God is deficient in some way. Perhaps atheism can't explain ethical truths or
The diligent little
existence of the
dwarves.
universe. Or
Nice to
maybe
see
God
him.
is needed to explain
This
something
guy was left
scientifically puzzling,
behind,
like the
but he's
fine-tuning
running
of the
quite
universe.
quickly.
So then, the
Wonder
theist
whether he
argues
will
we
die
should
it.
believe in God so that our theory is stronger in its explanatory power than it would be without it. Under the scientific worldview, God has become
16 left.
a tamed
Don't think I can
entity
take
of
everyone down, but I
something
like
that
the
can
diligence
create
of these
the value of a
small
variable
guys.
in our grand theory of the universe.
Dwarf
I
warrior.
think this is a mistake, but now is not the time to press this point.
Oh,
Again, subscribe as
did
a longer
take some
video on
down.
this is on my
That's
to-do
cool.
list. Okay, now to sum up the scientific worldview before moving on to its main rival in the culturals. According to scientism, given that God has died, the correct response is to simply shrug and double down on science.
Run to
Scientism
the
believes that
hills.
scientific truths are the only truths
Run
concerning
for
reality.
your.
Our common experience of the world that includes things like
That was
colours,
heavy.
dollars and sexual impropriety are all just features of our inner mental life.
Last guy? No,
And in
3
the end,
left.
there is no such substance as mind. There are just brains
got away.
with
I should
electrical
have
firing patterns. So
gotten here with these
ultimately,
guys.
there are no such things as minds.
Lol.
Not really. And the intelligent followers
3
of
of them
scientism
left. Where's
realize
the
this probably means
other
consciousness and
ones?
free will have to go too.
Here?
We are basically meat automata, entirely part of a completely mechanical universe.
Okay, whatever.
There's not much to fight a culture war with, though, is it? But I'll get to that and why this worldview is losing in section 6. The other response to the death of God I have called subjectivism. In essence, subjectivism is the view that since there is no God, there is no objectivity to be had. Neither objective values nor
That's a
objective
shitty theory.
ends. The quest for
Can
a
be
God's
less
ideals
or more
are
objective. It
abandoned
isn't like
together, and
binary.
everything is understood as being
More people believe it,
psychologically
it's more
and
objective.
socially constructed by human subjects, either as individuals or in society. The root of this worldview begins back in the 18th century with Immanuel Kant.
Nice.
Kant argued that the world we can know through experience, what he called the
One more
phenomenal
battle?
world, is structured by the categories of our understanding that our mind deploys to interpret it. For example, he thought that space and time and cause and effect were not necessarily features of the mind-independent world, but were the ways in which our mind comprehends the
Sure,
world.
melee attack.
Because of this, he thought that truths that concern our structures of
Can we
understanding
attack again?
can be certain. Since there cannot be a phenomenal world where they do not apply, they are necessary to it. These certain structural truths include things like the truths of geometry, pure mathematics, and the existence of universal causal relations.
Geometry doesn't
Note
exist
that unlike the
outside human
scientific
thought.
realists, Kant thought these truths do not concern the world outside the mind, but were structural features of the mind's capacity to experience the world. Now,
True.
Kant was the founder of what became known as German idealism, and the movement was still influential in the 19th century, especially in the European continent. Kant's idealism was called transcendental because he thought there was a mind-independent world,
Transcendental.
which he called the noumenal world. But it was one we couldn't experience or know.
Yeah, Kant had it
However,
right.
later figures in the movement, such as George Hegel, believed that these structures of the mind, and even more importantly, the rational movements of the mind, were not only the basis of the
why not?
phenomenal world of experience, but also of the objectively real world too. For Hegel,
Horsemen,
there is
let's go.
ultimately no distinction between thought and being. So the usual assumption about thought being directed to something else, namely existence outside of thought in the noumenal world, was rejected. But Hegel's philosophy relied on something
Okay, let's
called
attack
the
these guys.
absolute, which was the final and complete unification of all reality in the form of spirit. It is hard not to associate this absolute with
Why
a
can't you attack?
monotheistic God.
Come
And
on,
so with
obstructed?
Nietzsche, the
Why?
mental source of reality
Okay,
shifted
these guys are in
from
the
an
way. I get
absolute
you.
or
I get
objective
you.
entity to that of the human subject. Nietzsche realized that after God's death, there was no easy escape into science, because the death of God signaled the death of all objectivity, including that purportedly provided by science. Our pursuit of truth, undertaken in the development of the sciences, had, he thought, shown us to be creatures incapable of attaining objective truth. We had no divine imprint in our mind, and so no way of accessing any reality beyond appearances. And appearances were what they were, according to evolution, to promote survival and not to promote truth. This idea led to one of Nietzsche's key doctrines, that of perspectivalism. According to this view, all knowledge comes from a perspective, which is subject dependent and a psychological way of constructing and interpreting experience
What?
in order
I
to
attacked my own
create
guys?
knowledge.
No!
But unlike Kant, Nietzsche believed that these subject-dependent structures of experience were not universal. It was perfectly possible to have rather different perspectives on the world, and there was no perspective-independent way to determine which is the true perspective. But Nietzsche's doctrine was more than a theory about knowledge or human psychology. A perspective was not only the best we have access to, it is all there can be. Truth and reality themselves were a matter of perspective. The best kind of objectivity we can achieve then, he thought, is to understand the world from several perspectives, recognize the differences between them, and to use alternative viewpoints to overcome the
These guys need
limitations
to head
of any
back.
particular viewpoint. Just as perspectivalism claims we are the authors of truth, Nietzsche's
That one guy
claims that we
flew.
as individuals are
Flew
also
high
the
up in the
authors of all
sky.
values. Now that God has died, we realize there is no external moral force judging our actions either. Instead, it is up to us to create value and to strive for it. The herd, Nietzsche says, are bound by moral restraints, predominantly coming from Christianity. But the superior ones have shaken themselves loose of this slave-like state to become free. In this newfound freedom, they forge and pursue their own values beyond the concepts of good and evil. The existentialist thinkers that followed, like Jean-Paul Sartre, picked up Nietzsche's idea of the centrality of individual freedom and made it the ultimate value. Nietzsche's claims about the capacity for individualistically defining values became enlarged to include our individual freedom to define our own nature. This view is summed up by the phrase, existence precedes essence, from which we get the term existentialists. The idea that existence comes before essence is a hallmark of existentialist thinking. We first exist as raw and undefined entities, completely free and unformed. Our identities then become fashioned through a process of making decisions and acting freely, and we are entirely responsible for who we become. Since, Sartre says, we have the power and responsibility to create ourselves, we should do so with joy and authenticity. By living freely and authentically, you are in good faith. Whereas
That's why I play
refusing
games.
to accept the reality of your freedom and acting in a way that is unfree, Sartre called being in bad faith. It was a condition that mostly arose from allowing other individuals to tell you who you are and then living your life in conformity to those expectations. It is this kind of thinking that is
I think I
responsible
won.
for all of those "Just Be Yourself" t-shirts. But Sartre's existentialism came under heavy criticism after the World Wars for being too narcissistic and individualistic. Sartre seemed to leave no room for ethical action directed towards the community or other people.
Cool.
And given the great cost of the wars, what was then needed
One more?
was a philosophy
One more.
of social justice.
3 in a
Sartre
row.
thought to remedy
Let's
this
go.
in a landmark lecture entitled Is
Oscar.
Existentialism a Humanism?
Can we auto
In
battle
this
this?
lecture, he argued that no one can be free in
Nah.
a concrete sense unless everyone is free. And so we live our authentic, good faith lives when we live for the freedom of others. This idea was clearly a shift away from his previous individualistic claims. However, the idea of individual freedom leading to the working of freedom for others was developed by Sartre's romantic partner Simone de Beauvoir. She argued that the freedom to create ourselves and our values was not the free-for-all it might appear. The idea we had seemed to get from Nietzsche is that the death of God had liberated us to be free to create our own values.
Are they actually
But
coming
Beauvoir
towards
doesn't
us?
see freedom as
Oh
a
boy.
value on the way to
Poor
create
guys.
other
They should have
ways to
just
live.
run.
It is itself the value to live by and in service to. Real freedom, she thought, seeks to extend itself by
Lol.
working for the freedom of others. There is then a new morality in
Good
this,
luck.
based on the liberation of others
Little
from
Oscar
oppression,
boys.
so they can become their own authentic selves, free from the dictations of society. Following
You're surely gonna win.
there was a movement centered in France called structuralism. Rather than see people's activities as issuing from their own radical freedom, they emphasized the structures within societies and language
They're just
that
leaping out of
constrain and
joy.
direct the thoughts and actions of those within them. Structuralism, in
why
a way,
flee?
emphasizes the reality
You're good.
of the bad faith state Sartre discusses, and points to the ways in which we are all products of our language and societies. Structuralist thinking, then, threatens to
Poor guy.
erase the good faith state of the human
Last dude.
subject and its freedom
Last dude.
altogether. The philosopher Michel Foucault was initially very influenced by structuralism, but he later rejected it. In his earlier work, Foucault pointed to the ways Kant presents two kinds of subject. There is the subject that constructs the world through the categories of understanding, such as space and time and causality.
Treasure
And
50.
at the same time,
No.
there is the subject in the world that is constrained
Level
by the
20
same
general.
categories. How, Foucault asks, are we to unify
Cool.
these two aspects of the subject, both as the represented entity associated with our body and as the transcendent constructor of the phenomenal world
Racial type, blah, blah,
including
blah.
our body? Foucault sees two failed ways to do this. The first is naturalism, that attempts to
Frog.
reduce the subject to the empirical body, much like
Are we taking
scientism
damage per
does.
turn?
The second is phenomenology, that he thinks reduces the self to the knowing subject, held to be transcendent. Foucault rejects both of these approaches, since the full subject must, he thinks, be both a product of its history and development, i.e. be an empirical
suppose.
object in the world, yet also be involved in the constructive process of that
Cool.
history, i.e. be the originator of that empirical process. Otherwise, the self becomes something wholly external, and so not the self at all. His answer, at least in part, comes in the form of his account of power. By tracing the history of concepts such as madness, Foucault argued that what we assume
sure.
to be representational knowledge caused by our experience of the outside world is rather constructed in a dynamic process whereby knowledge is intertwined with power relations. Power produces knowledge, and knowledge becomes the means of producing power, according to Foucault. Because power relations produce knowledge, Foucault believes that power produces the discourses through which we understand ourselves and the world. So power shapes reality, truth, and even constructs us as subjects. Truth and being are, then, constructed through the power relations that exist in society.
Chaos corruption.
And our
71%.
activities as knowing
What?
subjects can then reinforce
70.
or subvert those power relations. The thinkers I have just mentioned are not without their
Okay,
critics,
this is
though,
better.
the most influential of
55.
whom is Jürgen Habermas.
Cool.
Habermas argues that
Need
their
to go
theories
there.
and methods commit the error of being self-refuting.
Neutral
On the
argument.
one hand, they undermine the idea there is any objectivity to be had, and or claim that everything is historically situated. Everything that is, except for the theories they propound and the methods they themselves deploy. One by one, Habermas points to the various thinkers in this tradition and spots inconsistencies and a reliance on the very metaphysical positions they claim to be rejecting. Regardless of these criticisms, it is thinking along the lines of the positions I have explored here that leads to the view that truth, the subject, our identity, and even reality are historically and socially constructed, and that these constructions maintain and produce
we march
power
on
relations
that
between
guy.
groups. This is a very different way of seeing the world to scientism, and these fundamentally different approaches have now severely come to blows in our culture. To see how the two views I have called scientism and subjectivism underlie the culture wars, I would like to focus on the way these worldviews approach two of the political questions of our time: gender and free speech. Suppose you approach the question of gender from the scientific perspective. First of all, you would recognise the biological categories related to reproduction, and these would be the obvious candidates for understanding gender. You might, however, allow for the objective data you get from psychology or other social sciences that show male and female-bodied people can and have considerable crossover in terms of their psychological traits. So you could accept that the traditional gendered social roles applied to people might not align with their preferences or psychology. And you could believe that these constraints concerning social expectations around gender could be unhelpful and perhaps should be got rid of. But what you wouldn't do is take seriously the way people feel about themselves subjectively as a suitable basis for categorizing reality. So you would reject any kind of appeal to an authentic inner self, such as that there might be male or female souls or minds trapped or contained within physical realities they are out of sync.
Whatevs.
Nor would it seem correct to you
We take
to think
care
that
of
the
these.
physical categories can be changed in any act of will or inner
Oh, we cannot.
reconception.
Okay.
Thought, in the scientific view, is not reality. And so no matter how you think about or conceive yourself, that cannot change the physical facts about reality or the kind of entity you are. From the subjectivist standpoint, however, there is no fixed categorized reality out there at all. It's all a matter of perspective, conception, or construction. And if you are a subjectivist of a certain sort, you might think it is those with power that have constructed things this way, even if unwittingly, and that such conceptions become oppressive and need to be overthrown through acts that undermine their supposed legitimacy. In this way of thinking, all categories are somewhat fluid. Perhaps they can be changed by individual self-conception, or perhaps they can only really be changed when they are reconfigured at the social level.
Yeah, we can just go here.
In which case, genuine change requires some
Chaos
kind of
corruption
social
57%,
recognition
not too
in order
bad,
to be
I guess.
effective. Either way,
We'll
you would
see.
start with the experiences of subjects and the categories they apply to themselves, and perhaps the way those categories in society lead to power relations between groups. And then think about categorizations that are better suited to the values you want to promote. Perhaps those values of freedom or equality. But what you wouldn't do is turn to scientific categories, or the supposed common sense opinions of the general population. These scientific categories are, after all, just the conceptual categories scientists apply for their own narrow purposes. And although these are perhaps
Can I
helpful
take
from
this?
a medical perspective, they provide no basis upon which to order these social interactions in society at large, nor the identities we present
Whatevs.
to others in that context. As for the common
Okay,
sense
time
views of
for the
general
battle.
population, these are typically too constrained by the status quo
Let's go.
to be a suitable guide to how things should be. To borrow from Nietzsche, the herd are too pushed around by the moral norms of their time. To borrow from Sartre, most people are in bad faith and not living their authentic self. And to borrow from Foucault,
Let's
the general
go.
population's knowledge is primarily the product
Why
of
can't
its
I go?
pre-existing power relations. So much for the gender
Battle with
debate.
Thorgrim,
What about
Quadspear's
free
army.
speech? The scientific
No!
perspective thinks that there are collective
teleport
truths to be
soon.
had, and that they can be gained through the deployment of correct scientific method. The enemy of such methods are those of pseudoscience, and in this regard, the social sciences responses are a mixed bag. As for scientific
Deploy a
knowledge production,
Thane hero.
free speech is very important.
Okay, so
For there is a
it can
shared
be
world
this
that we
guy.
can explore and experiment on. And
Probably.
given that shared world, the free
It's a lord,
transmission of
but it's not a
ideas and
Thane.
opinions
Ugh.
is the way in which false ideas become exposed and overcome, so that true ones
Runesmith,
can take
Thane.
their
We need
place.
Thorin.
In essence, free speech is an important condition for the open communication of ideas in rational dialogue that leads to the convergence of
Whatevs.
thought with reality. But what the scientific viewpoint would not consider is whether the expression of certain views might alter the conceptual framework of those that hear it, and thereby
sure.
transform the very nature of reality itself in ways that might be harmful. After all, in this view, reality is simply
let's
out
do this.
there, and the way in which we think about it can't make any difference to it. Knowledge is about reality, it cannot constitute it. But that is precisely the position the subjectivist viewpoint rejects. The subjectivist believes that reality itself is constituted by the categories we apply to it. If that categorization applies at the level of society, then if society does not affirm a particular category of things, then that category of things does not exist, nor then do the things that are categorized that way.
Not.
This is why some claim that questioning whether a person is what they say they are is to literally question their right to exist, or to attempt to erase them. Further, if the conceptual frameworks we deploy and the knowledge we have about reality are produced by power relations, then using free speech to make claims that the categories that we use are not legitimate is a power move that seeks to reorder reality or
Can we?
reinforce a particular reality already in existence.
Ooh, I don't like
Clearly,
these
such
dudes.
acts
Ice
are
walls.
far from neutral. They are attempts to do things. They are speech
Can't
acts
we attack?
in a political sense. Hence, speech
Noise.
acts that produce realities that are deemed harmful ought to be treated, they think, in the same way other harmful acts are treated, and therefore be subject to legal constraints with the prospect of being criminalized. In fact, since subjectivism believes that the concepts that we use to shape reality are encoded within the language society uses, one of the most central ways to reconstruct reality to be more equitable, or
Ice
whatever
trolls,
other value
please.
is deemed paramount, is to
Or
ensure
frog,
that linguistic
actually.
terms are deployed in a way that promotes a more equitable reality. Hence, the policing of language, either through the state, stigma, or otherwise, becomes a moral imperative, very much at odds with the supposed value of free speech. In this very brief analysis of two flashpoints in the current culture wars, I have tried to show that the essence of the conflict is not what it might seem to be. Loud and polarizing debates around such things as gender and free speech are merely the symptoms of a fundamental clash between two different worldviews. The scientific worldview values objective truth, rationality, and rigorous method, and so often assumes their opponents to be irrational, incoherent, and too caught up on
Should we go
subjective
back or
feelings.
something?
The subjectivist worldview, meanwhile, values the material effect forms of speech have on our thinking and the world of relations between humans living in society. And so they often assume their opponents to be either blind to their own privilege and power or deeply immoral. The situation we thus find ourselves in is increasingly one where communication misfires and the underlying worldviews mean that
Everyone
issues and
against
debates
Ice
are
Trolls,
interpreted
please.
this makes it hard for those with opposing worldviews
That guy
to be able
can
to
go
see the things
against
from the other perspective, and to
Horsemen.
communicate in ways that don't lead to offence-taking or to misrepresentation.
No,
Also, it means
don't
the
actually,
real
sorry.
fundamental disagreements
It's just
never get properly discussed. For those that shout the
this
loudest
thing.
typically have no idea concerning the underlying foundations of their views, and so the debate revolves around peripheral matters rather than the root issue. Public debate then becomes irrational, as appeals are made to emotive or fashionable considerations rather than reason and argument. In short, things aren't great in the public debate, and if the situation continues as it is,
Oh no.
I can see only one eventual winner. A few years ago, I was asked to give a talk at a political party conference. In it, I made a bold claim that if subjectivism was opposed only by scientism, then the progressive politics it underpins would eventually win the cultural wars. The reason I gave was that scientism lacked the tools to provide people with a framework for values. It had done okay so far because there was still a latent Christian ethic lurking in the background. But the new atheist movement ended that, which, paradoxically, became the beginning of the end
Throwing
of the
axes.
scientific worldview. The problem is that
that's an issue.
scientism has never successfully been able to provide a basis for meaning to life or morals. Very few, perhaps none, can genuinely embrace the nihilistic idea of there being no meaning or morals at all. Most people, especially the young, need some value framework to guide their lives. And the only game in town right now is some form of progressivism,
Bank?
underpinned by subjectivism.
Bank.
When I gave the talk, I knew there were some in the audience that disagreed with me, because they thought the contradictions inherent in some progressivist positions would mean they would collapse under their own weight. Such views,
this guy
they
needs
think,
to run
have
though.
since been borne out with the recent political developments in the so-called lurch to the right seen in many Western democracies. And there have been some voices in the media now declaring the end of progressive ideas around gender, family and nationhood. But I think those claims are vastly overblown, and I stand by my position still. I don't see any of the recent political changes being anything at all related to a movement back to a supposed rational scientific conception of the world. Quite the opposite. I see it as a reactionary takeover of a different form of
Actually,
subjectivity
you
based
go
irrationality.
here.
Truth in this movement is still constructed, is just being constructed differently and for different purposes. In short, it is still a post-truth movement. Others, however, disagreed with my thesis on different grounds by pointing to the re-emergence of interest in Christianity as a cultural force. Conservative political thinkers like Jordan Peterson, Ayaan Hirsi Ali, Douglas Murray and Louise Perry promote a cultural Christianity to act as a bulwark against what they take to be the damaging aspects of progressivism. But, well-meaning as these attempts might be,
Oh, they're
I don't think
still
they
attacking
cut
the
it.
trolls.
Intellectuals
No.
like those I just mentioned tend to mix their cultural Christianity with agnosticism. Church-going, Bible-reading and prayer, yes. The afterlife, Jesus' historical resurrection and the Creator God, not so much. And if we are at the stage where even Richard Dawkins is prepared to mumble something approving about cultural Christianity, I don't think it will cut the mustard when it comes to providing a substantive alternative. The root problem here is one that Plato knew very well.
Burlock
Cultural
is
values
getting
cannot
hammered
hang
by
on thin air.
our own
Christianity
units,
worked
maybe?
when it worked because it was rooted in a way of understanding
And
the world.
Frog.
Values only
Frog
maintain
kind of
their
sucks.
authority over us when they are in accordance with what we take to be the deep nature of things, when they accord with our metaphysical worldview. If they are just useful ideas, they're too easy to abandon when the occasion suits us. The problem facing us then is the absence of a metaphysics that can support objective values around which to build a coherent society.
Okay.
Nothing has replaced the role Christianity used to play in the West as the guarantor of justice and the worth of a life lived for the good of others.
Where is this guy?
What is needed, I claim, is a new metaphysics. But this isn't really my idea. I borrowed it from R.G. Collingwood. He saw what was to come
Why is that
back
guy
in
there?
1927 when he wrote his autobiography. And he placed the blame squarely at the feet of the emerging scientific philosophy. Here's a bit more detail. Collingwood held the chair of metaphysics at Oxford from
Kiting
1935
bastards.
until his early death in 1943. He
They're so
witnessed the
good at
rise of
kiting
the
too.
Oxford realists in his own university. The nascent analytic philosophy coming from Cambridge led by G.E. Moore and Bertrand Russell, and the logical empiricist movement on the continent. All these groups sought to attack and overthrow the idealist school of thought that had come before them, which was well
Guess
represented
we can
in Britain
all
through the British
go
idealists.
on those
I'll come back to the British
guys.
idealists in the next section, as it is this way of thinking that I want to present as the third way of reacting to the death of God. So hold tight for that. Collingwood was sympathetic to the idealist tradition and was concerned about the movement of philosophy away from questions around religion, meaning, and values. He could see this new philosophy becoming increasingly formal and technical in nature, since it was desperate to do philosophy in ways that mirrored science. Collingwood's concern with this was that as philosophy became further removed from something the public could understand and participate in, and as it began to deal in explanations and ideas that were far less applicable to everyday life, he thought this would mean public interest in philosophers and what they were discussing would fade away, and they would look to new sources for understanding life. Collingwood also thought that articulate and clear thinkers would become caught up in tangential debates, and so be removed from the domain of discourse where they were desperately needed.
That's not good.
The result, he thought, would be that public debate would become increasingly starved of the rational approach to understanding the philosophers bring to the table. And he thought this would leave the public discourse open to bad actors that would promote emotive and irrational views for their own ends. For Collingwood, these bad actors were likely to be the fascists that were gaining influence at that time on the continent. But the concern would apply to any form of irrational creep into public discourse, including the demagoguery, misrepresentation, slander, and appeals to emotion used in current debates from all sides. With the decline of religion, Collingwood thought society needed rational and careful thinkers to present coherent and meaningful frameworks.
These X-Men are doing their job.
Life. But just as this need became particularly acute, Collingwood could see philosophers disappear into their university halls, discussing technicalities and engaging in wordplay. The school of thought that was most needed now, that of British idealism, was, he thought, being sidelined and disappearing, and Collingwood could see trouble. I have had a very interesting discussion of Collingwood and his views on philosophy with Dr. Martin Steenhagen that you can see using the link above me and in the description. Personally, I think we are at the same point now. Public discourse is typically irrational, and the scientists have little of use to say to us. What we need is a return to a more relevant form of philosophical thinking. So then, what was this idealist view Collingwood was sympathetic to? How did it die out? And why do I think we need to bring it back? Glad you asked. Scientism and subjectivism have arisen, as I have argued, in response to the death of God event, and are, I believe, two different forms of atheism. The one emphasizes a mechanistic but objective reality, the other a personal but human-centered foundation to all things. In the first, ultimate reality is a machine. In the second, it is us. But in the second half of the 19th century, an alternative response to the death of God arose. It was one that was not avowedly theistic, but it did have theistic themes. A little earlier, English translations of German idealism, especially Hegel, had been introduced into the UK, and it was recognised that here were the seeds required to intellectually reconcile the existing religious temperament with the new sciences. But it was also realised that to do this, Hegel's firmly rationalist, thought-based understanding of reality needed a good dose of traditional British empiricism to make it fly with science. The school that took up the challenge of developing this thought became known as British idealism, as its main proponents were indeed British. But the American Josiah Royce was in the same camp as well, and there were some similarities between it and the American pragmatism promoted at the time by the likes of William James. Although there were also some strong differences between the British idealists and the pragmatists as well. So, how does British idealism differ from the worldviews I have described? Well, it isn't simply a matter of theism versus atheism, as the three principal members of the movement differed in the entirety of human experience, not only our sense experience, and a belief that reality is, at its most fundamental, sentient. Here, then, we get an initial idea of how the school differs from those I have mentioned. On the one hand, unlike the scientific worldview, it recognises that aspects of our mental life are reflective of the nature of reality. Reality is not merely out there, independent of our structures of thought, nor is it isolated from our process of knowing and experiencing it. On the other hand, unlike the subjectivist worldview, there is objectivity to be had, for there is a privileged mental state beyond the private and collective states and perspectives of humans. Reality itself contains something akin to thought, and so reality sets the standards to which thought should strive if it is to attain truth. The contrast could also be explained like this. Scientism presents reality as an object, which is subject independent, and so it struggles to account for subjective aspects of experience, such as values, meaning, and even consciousness and free will. Subjectivism presents reality as purely subject dependent, constructed by humans, and so struggles to justify their own claims and ends up interpreting things in terms of power or something similar. Idealism, of the sort I'm considering, however, presents reality as itself an objective subject.
One more
an
guy.
entity of a sort that can play the role
Let's go.
God used to play
Let's get
in providing
the
meaning,
wall
values,
chariots down.
and truth.
Yay.
Okay, I realise there is a lot more to say and justify here. And rather than dive deeply into the nuances and differences of the thinkers in this tradition, I would like to highlight some specific ways in which this approach to understanding reality differs from the ones I have mentioned. I will focus here on the thought of F.H. Bradley, the philosopher generally considered their champion and the one I know best. I'll also argue that some scientific developments indicate that Bradley was broadly correct in much of his analysis, and we ought to take his work very seriously. First, one of the main things that distinguishes Bradley's
Six
approach
dudes
to
left.
philosophy
Come
is his
on.
methodology.
4 dudes left.
Bradley believes that philosophy is the attempt to
Can we
find
get it to, like,
intellectual
one at least?
satisfaction. It is, in a way,
0
a
would be nice,
personal
though.
journey. A journey that seeks to understand the human experience, especially that which transcends the
Ooh,
everyday.
3. I think
And
that's
the goal of
as
philosophy, he thinks, is
that's as
rest
well
and
as we can
contentment
do.
in the intellectual domain. This, he thinks, must be done rigorously, carefully, and with great effort. And he ultimately thinks that complete satisfaction will elude us.
Or could we get
despite our
one more
best
volley?
efforts. Nevertheless, it is the degree to which our understanding satisfies the intellect
Ooh,
that is
this
the
guy
ultimate arbiter of the theories
is
we should accept.
really
And
attacking.
although not everyone needs to embark on this journey, there is great reward in the pursuit of it for those that are wired in a certain way. He writes, "All of us, I presume, more or less, are led beyond the region of ordinary facts, some in one way and some in others. We seem to
That guy's
touch
a
and
bit
have
too good.
communion with what is beyond the visible world. In various manners, we find something
Run,
like,
Thane,
which both
run!
supports and
Or
harms,
not Thane.
both chastens and transports us.
What are you?
And with certain persons,
Rune
the intellectual effort to
Scaper?
understand the universe is a principal way of thus experiencing
Will he
the deity.
actually get
No
there?
one, probably, who has not felt this, however differently he might describe
Tremble
it,
Orc,
has ever
or
cared much for
not Orc.
metaphysics.
Nordman.
And wherever it has been felt strongly, it has been its own justification. The man whose nature
Tremble,
is such that by one
more
path
older
alone his chief
champion.
desire will reach consummation, will try
This
to
guy
find it on
is
that
gonna
path,
get ya.
whatever it may
Burlock
be,
the Orc
and whatever
Bane.
the world thinks of it.
on
And if he
your
does not,
on your
he is
trail.
content. Contrast this with the methodology of analytic philosophy. Here,
What's
the way
gonna
to decide
do?
which theories
Bang.
to adopt comes down to considerations
One more
of
guy.
theory choice, such as simplicity,
One more guy.
elegance, and the
One more guy.
application of principles
Let's
like
do this.
Occam's razor. These ideas are drawn straight from the playbook of the natural sciences.
Nice.
They are hardly justified on that account as a method of
You a
philosophy.
good
Why should
dude,
we
Burlock.
think
You a
principles of
good
theory
dude.
choice would lead to philosophical truth? For Bradley, such principles have their legitimacy in philosophy, if at all, from the way they are general features of what we find intellectually satisfying. A simple explanation is more satisfying than a convoluted one. An explanation that is more powerful
Nice.
and applies to more domains is also more
Yeah,
satisfying
let's execute.
than one that is less unified. But Occam's razor, regularly taken as a principle of what exists, is a different story. This principle, remember, says that you should not multiply entities more than necessary.
Manlings of
This,
Sigmar,
for
they have
Bradley,
witnessed the
could not be a
station
matter
of
what there
flame.
is, but only a practical consideration for a theory with limited ends. He says,
Give them
"It
fire.
is doubtless
Sure.
scientific, to disregard certain aspects when we work.
Like chaos. Ooh,
But to urge that therefore
runes
such aspects
Smith
are
is
fact, and that what we
chaotic
use
now.
without regard to them is an independent real thing, this is barbarous
Movement range
metaphysics.
is increased.
Ignoring
That's
aspects
nice.
of experience, then, might be fine for sciences that restrict their attention to limited domains of reality. If you're not trying to explain, say, ethics, consciousness, and free will, but only the physical world,
An upgrade.
by all means, disregard our experience of our moral conscience, sense experience, and agency, since it makes your theory simpler. But metaphysics is trying to understand the whole of reality with no remainder. So cutting out aspects of experience because they are not included in some domain
auto result, maybe?
is unacceptable. Any experience we have is data that must be accounted for in our metaphysical theory. And it is barbarous metaphysics to simply deny their existence or to think the rest of reality can be completely independent of such things. Our understanding of reality would be deeply unsatisfying to the intellect if it rejected such fundamental aspects of experience. Bradley, then, would not be impressed with fancy arguments that claim there is no morality, that we have no free will, or that consciousness is an illusion, all on the basis of the impossibility of fitting them within some theory from the sciences.
Let's try
If
this.
such experienced things cannot be accounted for within some theory, then that theory cannot be the complete theory of reality. On this point, for sure, I am wholeheartedly in agreement.
Reinforcement.
And this leads us on to think about another aspect of how philosophy is typically done in the analytic tradition. As I mentioned earlier, Quine held the view that to be is to be the value of a variable. This has become the methodology for deciding what exists. The idea is, remember, that you get your best theory and read off from that the entities that that theory ranges over.
Ooh, this artillery.
You then say that the entities you need to talk about in that theory are the entities that exist. Again, this is how a realist interpretation of science often proceeds. If you
Why are they just standing still? Are they just overwhelmed by my forces?
Exist. Bradley would completely reject this view, because it rests on the assumption that existence is ultimately rooted in thought or language. And Bradley believed that thought is necessarily abstracted from existence and contains only ideal content. To use his terminology, thought concerns a descriptive what of reality and cannot contain the existential that of it. For Bradley, where we encounter existence is in feeling, not in thought. We experience the being of reality when it is given to us immediately in our present conscious experience. This, of course, includes our sense experience, but also other immediate experiences like emotions, pleasures, and pain. Since feeling is where we encounter existence, it must be accounted for within any theory of reality. So reality involves more than thought. It must also include feeling. We now have another piece of the sentience puzzle in place.
Ooh, hidden forces.
And in feeling, we encounter reality most immediately and directly in its thatness, i.e. in its existence. But the immediate felt reality is experienced as a whole, since thought has not yet abstracted out aspects of its content and differentiated it. And until our immediate encounter with reality is structured by our concepts of thought, we are unable to express what we experience in language. This is a big idea, so let's sit on it a moment longer. Kant thought that our categories of understanding were prerequisites to experience the phenomenal world. So we needed the structures of thought in place before anything could possibly be experienced.
Try to get rid of his
structures of thought came first. They were the conditions of knowledge and experience, and so were transcendent. This is why his idealism was called transcendental idealism. The subjectivist view I described earlier picked up Kant's idea and ran with it. But then this structure was not universal and given, but constructed. And so by changing the conceptual structures by which we experience the world, reality itself can be changed. This reorganization of our conceptual structures was achieved through power, knowledge acquisition, and transforming language. Bradley's idea, though, is the inverse of this. He thinks our first point of encounter with reality is unstructured, direct, and immediate. The being of reality is encountered in feeling before our intellect begins to organize and structure it to
This
become
will
accessible to
be
thought
major.
and thereby language. This process, he thinks, is achieved
Can we
through
just get rid of them?
abstraction, which is directed through our faculty of attention.
Ouch.
Once thought abstracts
That sucks, though.
content from that felt reality, we can then use it to construct the idea of a world outside of that which we, as finite creatures, are now experiencing. In other words, we use the ideas we draw from feeling to construct the idea of a world that continues beyond the horizon and that existed in the past and will continue into the future.
Let's go.
Stop for a minute.
Let's get
and see
rid of
how this
them.
idea fits well
Right
with
now.
what we know about infant psychology.
Right now?
Until an infant reaches a certain age,
Come
it's believed that
on,
they have
the
no
one
concept
chariot.
of a world outside of their immediate experience.
Is it really gonna
And it
survive?
is also believed that this experience is undifferentiated. Even the notion of a self separate from an environment is absent. So an infant doesn't experience "I am hungry," for that distinguishes the subject, the I, from its state, the hunger it feels. The infant experiences only hunger as if it were a state of the entire world. Also, when, for example, their mother leaves the room, the infant experiences the loss of their mother from existence and so cries. They have no concept of the mother continuing to exist out of sight. At a certain stage of development, however, the child begins to formulate the conception of a world
Nice.
outside of their immediate
We're winning.
experience.
Son?
And they then conceptually model that world and use that model to predict their potential experiences and to direct their activities in more useful ways.
These will die at...
One way psychologists check to see if a child has reached that stage of development is to see how they react to dropping something. For example, if an infant in a pram drops a toy to the ground where they can't see it, then their behaviour will demonstrate whether they have developed a conception of the independent world yet. The infant that cries or gets upset but is then comforted when the carer picks up the toy
Let's
and
go.
returns it to them
Let's get rid of the
is still
chariot
at
now.
an earlier stage.
Maybe?
Whereas the infant that sits up and leans
Maybe.
over the edge to see where the toy landed has realised that there is
Come
a
on,
outside
that
of their
chariot's
experience and has
bit of
conceptually
a hero.
Now, this distinction between the felt immediate experience of the world
Nice.
and the one that is parcelled up and modelled by our thought
And now
isn't only a distinction
versus
in
Chaos
infants.
Spawn.
A common distinction made in contemporary philosophy of mind is that between what Ned Block calls phenomenal consciousness and
Come on,
access
yay,
And
finally.
this distinction closely parallels the distinction with what Bradley calls immediate experience and relational experience. The latter, relational experience, is the experience we have once our intellect has structured it for thinking and talking about it. See the reference list in the description for more information about Ned Block's views. Bradley's distinction also seems related to work in neuropsychology that suggests different parts of our brain experience the world differently. The aesthetic regions of our brain do not discriminate things from their environment, but perceive it in the whole. Whereas
Out of
regions
ammunition?
the brain
No,
more
there's
closely
20.
linked to language
Come on.
and reasoning narrow our focus via attention to make distinctions, and so experience things in isolatable and structured ways. The work of Ian McGilchrist explores this idea in depth. See the references for that. Okay, so one immediate difference
Why
between this
abstract it,
approach to
though?
understanding and others is that reality is more than can be captured in language, and so therefore more
I'm basically
than can
attacking
ever be
myself
captured
here,
by
so,
feeling
yeah.
expressed in language. It provides a hard limit then to any attempt to fully understand the world, since our intellectual
nice.
faculties fall short of the
Let's
whole.
get rid of
This
the
leads Bradley to a
chosen.
few conclusions. One is humility in what can intellectually be articulated and known, which leaves him open to endorsing pursuits like art and religion as other ways of understanding reality using different aspects of our encounter with it. Another is Bradley's very idiosyncratic view about the nature of truth, which is very important to understand. Scientism is generally linked with the idea that truth is a matter of correspondence. If it is true
Nice.
that electrons have negative charge, then it must be because parts of that thought match up with those same parts in reality.
For
In reality,
chosen.
there are such things as electrons, and these electrons really do have the real property of negative charge. These reality-based structures of things and their properties are facts, and when thoughts are true, it must be because they correspond to the facts that there are. By the way, there are lots of problems with the correspondence view of truth, some of which I discuss in a lecture linked in the description. For Bradley, however, truth is something we aim at in judgment. Judgment is the act whereby we take some thought we have intellectually
Whatevs.
constructed from aspects of feeling and then try to reunite it with the existence we encounter in feeling and abstracted it from in the first place. This is not the attempt to reunite it with our own finite feeling, but with reality as a whole, which includes both
Yeah,
thought
cool.
and feeling in their full completeness.
That was not close
Both
at all.
the that
Come on.
of experience and its fully differentiated what of its content. We can see here already Bradley's break with scientism and subjectivism. Truth is objective because we encounter reality in feeling, not in thought. Feeling is objective
1K?
since it is given
Nah.
to us and not constructed. And there are no facts outside of thought, there is only a felt whole. So thoughts we have about reality, by being
one more.
essentially structured, cannot ever match up completely.
Let's go.
Truth is, he thinks, therefore, a matter of degree. The degree to which our thought harmonizes with reality
Need
as
to get
a
rid of the main
If
hero
thought were ever to
first.
attain complete truth, it would have to expand beyond its limits and merge with feeling, and it would thereby become reality itself.
Sure.
The above few points are really just a taste of how radically different this metaphysical view is, and I haven't even mentioned the way he argues for will or volition as a third aspect of reality, nor the way he adopts a pragmatist view on the aims and theories of science, a view that now finds fertile defense in contemporary work by the likes of Hassok Chang and Hugh Price.
Where is the hero?
Nor have I broached Bradley's view on God and religion. But I hope what has been said can give you some idea of a very different way of understanding the world, and how it could be rigorous, scientifically coherent, and
Let's
also provide the kind
go.
of understanding our culture
Chaos
really
Warhounds,
needs.
you
An
diet.
understanding of things
No.
like meaning, morality, and an understanding of how objectivity can be had when we are limited to a finite and subjective viewpoint. Where Bradley eventually ends up is with the view that reality is a privileged subject, which comprises the standards against which our finite experience can
nice.
be compared. Those standards are not only standards for thinking, but also for feeling and for acting. Reality is the ultimate thought, the ultimate feeling, and the ultimate act. It is comprised of the aims of these domains by being a unification of truth, beauty, and goodness. Meaning for life, then, becomes the attempt to align and harmonize our subjective aspects of experience with
Lol.
those of ultimate reality, by leading lives dedicated to the pursuit of truth, beauty, and goodness. I am now making it my life's work to formulate and articulate this third way of thinking for our current context, and thinking about how it might be applied. And I'm working on a course that goes chapter by chapter through Bradley's primary metaphysical work, Appearance and Reality, and I'll explain and update his arguments and ideas contained within it. My intention is that by the end you will see how compelling this way of understanding the world really is, and you would have the tools to be able to rethink what is possible. If that sounds interesting, please sign up to my email list using the link in the description, and I'll get information
these
about
guys.
it out to you as soon as it's available.
We'll
Thanks
try
for
to get rid
watching.
of
I
them.
hope you found this interesting, and I'll see you around.
This is Democracy Watch. Mark, with all eyes on the Epstein files, there obviously exists the distinct possibility that we may see a situation where Trump does release something that may have been altered. So what are the legal implications, first and foremost,
Obstructed?
if there is some
Ew.
information that's been doctored or altered in some type of way?
Yeah, so first of all, we need to set the stage here, Brian, in that Donald Trump is already laying this out, right? he has said that he believes there are these files, or he's acknowledged now there are these files. He has said that he believes they were written by Democrats, and he's listed a whole series of Democrats who he says has written them. And he earlier today said essentially, I will release stuff that is credible. I think that was the word he said. Basically, Pam Bondi could release the stuff that is credible, but the fake stuff, the stuff that the Democrats all wrote, can't be. So you can start to see the.
Let's do another video. Philosophy, bullshit, let's go. Julian de Medeiros.
Lecture, if you will, on philosophy and theory. And today I would like to make the case that you should try reading theory. Which is to say, in this video, I would like to talk a little bit about what I think are some of the benefits of getting into reading theory, share with you some of my own experience when it comes to reading theory and how I first got into reading theory, talk a little bit about what theory actually is and what types of theory there are, and maybe debunk some of the popular myths or tropes about theory, and see if we can use this as sort of general introduction
Let's go.
to reading theory. But my basic pitch, if you want to call it that, is that reading theory is a way to make everything more interesting. Like for me, when you start reading theory, movies become more interesting, art becomes more interesting.
That's nice.
Politics becomes less doom and gloom and more interesting because you start being able to understand and analyze ideology. It makes philosophy more interesting. It makes literature more interesting. In fact, I think that as a simple hack, if you will, for getting interested in things, theory can be a really good lens to apply to the world. And I think that overall, I would make the case that perhaps the best way to not succumb to depression and anxiety and the sense of pervading doom is to remain interested. That as long as we feel like we have a stake in things, like a reason to read things and learn things and discover new things, then we actually feel more alive. And so for me, theory was always a way to be more actively interested in the world. And to be totally honest, I never particularly enjoyed reading books or literature until I started reading theory. In fact, I wasn't even really that much into art or politics or even poetry, cinema,
Let's
until
go.
I started reading theory. So I think that theory can be a really good way into enjoying other things and sort of enriching them. That's my sort of general pitch, but I'd like to give you a more step-by-step explanation of how you can start reading theory and what theory actually is. So before I begin, I want to briefly give you a personal story about how I started reading theory. When I was in university, this was, so briefly, I'm not sure if I've shared this before, but I did my bachelor's at the University of Utrecht in the Netherlands.
Let's go.
And I did my bachelor's in both history and Portuguese language and culture.
One more guy.
Now,
Come
I
on.
actually flunked out of history
Nice.
after my first semester, because at the time, so many people were studying history that they had to kick people off the course. And one of the ways in which they did that was that they had these immensely difficult exams that were full of historical facts and a lot of memorization. And it turns out that I hated that. I hated the idea that history was a kind of just applied expertise
massacre.
or niche that you had to develop. Already then, I should have known that I had, if you will, a more theoretical way of approaching things, which at the time wasn't very popular in the Netherlands, at least not in my department. And so I flunked out of history after the first semester, and I continued with Portuguese language and culture. And what I liked about Portuguese language and culture was that it had a strong emphasis on post-colonial theory, which is actually how I got into reading other types of theory.
2 guys left, come
But
on.
I can explain that later. But my first experience actually reading a piece of theory and enjoying it was when we were assigned
Get stuck in the woods.
opening chapter of Michel
Nice.
Foucault's The Order
Almost.
of Things. And it's such an unusual opening because he actually starts by having a literary analysis of a text by Borges. Here's a
Can we
text that
maybe
Borges
get
had
these
recently
guys?
written. And if I remember correctly, it's been a while since I've read this. Michel Foucault basically
The two
analyzes
chosen
one
who
of
are
Borges'
left.
stories about a fictional encyclopedia in which meaning is attributed to categories in a very different way.
I mean,
which is
they're
to say it's an
pretty cool
imaginary
guys to get away
taxonomy.
from an army
Instead
like
of
that.
classifying the world in the way which we ordinarily would, it has a completely
sure.
different way of structuring our reality. And Michel Foucault uses his, if you will, analysis of that Borges story to make an argument about the way in which we apply taxonomy and ideology to our own lives, the order of things. And that was so mind-blowing to me. Like, at this point I was like 18, 19 years old, and I read a lot, and I'd learned a lot, but I'd never actually read a piece of theory. I'd never actually looked at the world in this way. It was so incredible to me that you could take a text from Borges, which was essentially idea-driven, and then apply that to, if you will, a philosophical and critical argument about the nature of our own reality, which is to say it was the very first time that I read a text that made me feel engaged as a reader. Like I wasn't just passively consuming it or supposed to admire it as one of the best things ever written, etc., but it was actually inviting me as the reader into a critical discourse, not just with Foucault, with Borges, but in a sense with the world. And that was immensely exciting to me. Like I really remember that. But the reason I remember it is twofold. It's because I thought I'd made this major discovery, and the next day I went back into class. This would be our assigned reading, and I was super excited
Do
to
these
discuss this
guys
text.
have
I was
movement?
like, wow, this is the
Yeah,
first
they
time I
do.
read something
Nice.
that really resonated with me. Like, now I understand why people want to read books. And then I realized that some of my best friends in class, they had not had that experience at all. In fact, they were quite angry. They were really angry with Foucault because they thought it was the worst piece of writing they'd ever
Okay, can we do this?
read.
Probably.
Like, they thought it was alienating, that it was jargon-laden, that it was abstract, that it didn't make a point. All of the sort of common accusations that you've probably encountered when it comes to French philosophical post-war writing. And that was immensely puzzling to me because it was the first time that I realized that what I
let's get rid of the hero now.
which spoke to me very much, wasn't necessarily true for everybody else. Now, this isn't to suggest that I had some, like, heightened intelligence or enlightened understanding. I think it was simply because I experienced a moment, like a little epiphany, where it felt like this text came to me as an arcane puzzle. Like, there was so much that I didn't understand, but it meant that there was so much more that I wanted to learn. And, like, that's the thing I think about reading theory, but also philosophy, which is that it's essentially a world-building exercise. Like, one of the slightly boring things about reading books that are just part of the mainstream press is that they're products, essentially. Like, they've been perfectly edited so that you can consume them as a reader, that you can read them and get the main ideas and move on with your life. But a theory text doesn't really do that. Like, a piece of theory actually is going to raise a lot of questions, introduce a lot of ideas and concepts that it essentially assumes you already understand partially, or, what I believe to be true, it challenges you. It challenges you to go out and do more reading. Like, one of the fun things for me is that, like, there's a world-building element to reading theory where there's always something else that you feel like you want to read. And as you read over the years, you piece together the knowledge, and then it kind of expands. And I think this is actually where one of the negative stereotypes comes from when it comes to, like, the theory bro, which is that everybody has this negative stereotype, understandably, of the theory bro, the insufferable person who just wants to mansplain all these concepts to you, who treats you like an inferior person for not understanding jargon-laden concepts, etc. But I think part of it is that maybe, and this is just my theory, maybe we haven't really built a community around theory where we can share the excitement of discovering theory and how it relates. Like, fundamentally, like, my personal journey when it comes to reading and studying theory is very nerdy. Like, it's a geek thing. In the same way that we used to love talking about, like, Pokemon or Magic the Gathering or the lore of Warhammer 40k, like stuff that really required an intense, almost obsessive fixation with one thing. In the same way, I was able to take that energy and apply it to theory. Because once you start studying theory, it makes you realize that there is so much lore. Like, there's literally so much that you need to know. And then you start going on side quests. Like, then you might start reading some Kierkegaard or some existentialism. When you go on another side quest into, I don't know, reading any form of theory, literary theory, film theory, phenomenology, psychoanalysis.
What are these guys doing?
Critical race theory, which of course has become very polemical. Cultural studies, critical terrorism studies, critical legal studies. It's this enormous body of work that shares certain themes and considerations, but ultimately you get to choose your own adventure. And to my mind, it was like the first time that I'd read something that really made me feel like actively engaged. Like, you could spend your whole life reading more of it, and then it opens new avenues and new thoughts. In fact, I'll challenge you to this. If you start reading theory, and then you go watch a movie, or read a book, or go to an art gallery, or even just go to the supermarket and engage in day-to-day activities, you will find that your brain starts making connections in relationship to the theory that you've read. Like, that's the power of
Okay,
theory,
we're
is that
surrounding
it kind
frog.
of
That's
sparks
nice.
all of these new connections in the world, which is a super,
Thank
to
you
my
for
mind,
the
addictive way
spam.
of being in reality, because it makes you
Dinner.
so much less passive and so much more actively engaged. Okay, so now that I've explained that a little bit, my own journey into theory, which ironically started with Michel Foucault, and I'm not really into Foucault that much anymore. Like, I spent a lot of time reading everything that he'd written in all of his lectures until I got to the point where I thought, well, I'm not sure I actually agree with this, which is also one of the beauties of reading theory, right? You're not reading it for a master who tells you what to think. You're reading it because you're trying to figure out what you think. Anyway, let's talk a little bit about what theory actually is. And I want to start a little bit askew, which is to say I want to show you Terry Eagleton's Literary Theory, which is a book that makes an argument about what literary theory is, but actually also in so doing makes a lot of arguments about theory as such. In fact, this book was based on a seminar that he taught at, I believe it was Warwick, at the University of Oxford, which at the time was like a really revolutionary thing to do, to sort of go against the strict, old school interpretation of analyzing English literature, to introduce the suspiciously French and continental idea of a literary theory. And his basic argument is very simple. He says we can't make a distinction between literature on the one hand and ideology on the other, because literature is an ideology. And that, to my mind, is actually one of the basic starting points that you have to understand for theory. It argues that the world is essentially a text that we can learn to read. In fact, that the world is something, reality is something that is subject to interpretation. And of course, in so doing, subject to a critical interpretation. What are the ideologies, the power structures, if you will, the mechanisms that structure our reality? In fact, how do things appear to us as natural or common sense? And who does it benefit for us to view the world in those ways? This is also why theory is sometimes referred to as a hermeneutics of suspicion, which is to say it casts an inherently suspicious glance at the world and how it is presented to us. Slavoj Žižek's definition of philosophy, by the way, is heavily influenced by theory. He says, philosophy begins as soon as we refuse to accept what exists as given. That's essentially the impulse of all theory. That you look at the world around you and that you apply a critical interpretive lens, i.e., in some way, that you treat the world not as a given, but as an ideological product, if you will. But that's very broad still. So let me give you some of the historical, if you will, avenues into theory. So for a very long time, we don't even talk about it. Instead, it's philosophy. system building is the main idea within philosophy. You need to have a Gesamtphilosophie that is usually related to some Grundeinsicht, which is to say you need to have a total philosophy, a system that explains everything, that is related to one key or core insight. And sort of the beginning of this, the systematizing drive within philosophy, is something that Plato does on the one hand, or to be precise, Plato does it through the Socratic dialogue, and then we have Aristotle on the other side. Both of them have totalizing visions of the world in very different ways. We have Platonic idealism that renders the world essentially secondary to the essence of the ideal, some super phenomenological entity that cannot or perhaps can be known. And then we have Aristotle, who kind of inverts this to simplify it and focuses on the world as we know it. What can be examined, what can be studied, what can be
terrifying?
conducted. And in this distinction between Plato and Aristotle, of course, Aristotelianism comes from within Platonic thought in some ways. Born out of
nice.
To put it in somewhat Marxist
More?
terms.
Please?
In this division, this binary, if you will, between Plato and Aristotle, we have the beginnings of two completely different worldviews. One of them is an idealism,
Abstracted.
the other one is a sort of early scientism, which is also another way of saying that one of them is a perceived objectivism, namely idealism as an objective system.
Poor
of all
guy.
human beings,
It seems
ontology, if you will,
he's pretty
versus the
spent.
subjective system, which is Aristotelian thought that focuses on categories of thought and reason. In fact, where Aristotle becomes somewhat idealist himself
cool.
is in the notion of thought thinking itself, a pseudo-mystical conception of how that essentially reconciles the problem of ontology with teleology. Ontology being the nature of being, that which exists in reality. Teleology being the purpose, namely why it exists, what it is for. And the Aristotelian principle was that if you can find out what something serves, i.e. what it is for, then you also know what it is. He essentially makes teleology an ontological category or principle. But those are already like abstract terms, so you don't need to fully understand them quite yet. But in these two camps, essentially, we have the beginning of a philosophical project, which is how can we think of reality in a way that includes everything? Nothing is exempt from it. They're essentially totalizing worldviews. And this idea of philosophy as a kind of Gesamtphilosophie continues throughout the entire history of philosophy. Like, Kant, in his critique of pure reason, is already pulling at the seams. He's undermining the possibility of truly objective knowledge of reality, namely to truly know essence, or what he famously calls das Ding an sich, the thing in itself. But he nevertheless upholds the idea that it is possible. Well, not really possible, i.e. we can't do it, but the fact that we can't do it means that it is there. What I like to call the Kantian cop-out, which is to say, reason is subjective reason is a barrier towards the essence or ideal of the ontologically pure object, and yet it is precisely because of this barrier that it nevertheless exists behind it. Anyway, Hegel, huge leap to Hegel. Hegel is the ultimate
what are you doing here?
The ultimate world builder. And yet, the paradox, if you will, a paradox which we often refer to as the dialectic, a word that Hegel himself didn't necessarily use all that often, is that Hegel's philosophy, his system of philosophy, his logic, is also, if you will, it's hard to find the appropriate word for it, an anti-system. A system which includes not only everything, but also that which cannot be included within it. Which is to say, Hegel's basic insight, to simplify it to the extreme, is that if a philosophical system wants to be truly absolute,
15K.
it must
We'll get
also
there.
include everything which cannot be included in it. Like, if you think about it, this was the Kantian problem. How can we include subjective reason in ontological purity if subjective reason is already a barrier to it? Hegel kind of takes this problem and says that it is actually the solution. A truly complete philosophical system must include
Maybe
everything
let's get some
that is by
slayers
definition
in.
excluded. determinate negation being
Aura
the
for
word
now.
for this. And so Hegel accomplishes a kind of a paradox, which on the one hand, he like wraps up the entire philosophical edifice and puts a bow on top, which is part of why he says,
Chaos
you know,
reigns.
this is the end of philosophy, I've completed it, philosophy is done, essentially.
Ask your favor,
The end of
and I will
history.
check with the Demas Crom that
He
you are
wraps
worthy.
it up. But at the same time,
sure.
his wrapping it up also blows it open. Hegel blows open philosophical opportunity, and it scatters in every possible direction.
Snorri,
And
Snorri.
Marx picks up one of these pieces. And Marxist theory, which is therefore both a scientism, i.e. a supposedly objective theory about the nature of the unfolding
Where's
of
the
history,
chaos
seen through
forces?
a lens of political economy,
Here?
is therefore the emergence of a, if you will, post-philosophical or even anti-philosophical theory.
These
Which is
guys?
to say, theory is the continuation
Here.
of philosophy by other means. To continue in a
Yeah, cool.
totalizing philosophy after Hegel seems impossible, at least if you properly understand the consequences of Hegelian thought. Hence why after the Hegelian
let's get an army there,
implosion,
I
which
guess.
is also an explosion, philosophy is now both fractured and yet open. And here, this is also,
Chaos.
if you will, historical phenomenon, which to say that the anti-philosophical movements, which are therefore in a sense Hegelian, go
Okay,
in
that
all
was
kinds of new
a
directions
mistake.
that are
Damn
overdetermined,
it.
or if you will, influenced by the innovations, both technological and ethical and moral and of consciousness of the 18th and 19th centuries. And so we have the emergence of psychoanalysis
Lots of armies though.
as a theory. The Freudian theory of the unconscious is a theory that is only made possible because of this Hegelian influence. We have the Marxist theory of political economy and world revolution.
I mean, this might be the empire, but it's not for long
And
if chaos
these become hugely influential.
thrives.
But of course, they're not necessarily engaged in philosophy. They're both anti-philosophical. Freud isn't into philosophy. Marx is against philosophy and against religion to some extent. The famous line from Marx is that philosophers have only thought about, you know, the world, but the point is to change it, etc.
Okay,
Now, I'm
we
not going to
should
explain here the
maybe
influence
teleport
of
back.
materialism or the discovery of the unconscious. I've done that in other lectures, and we can do that again in the future. But I want to make a leap here to what you might call post-war theory. Because what most people encounter as theory, like on the internet or in school,
Yeah, let's
is
do that.
usually either critical theory, namely theory that is related to the so-called Frankfurt School, and it might be that you've seen critical theory from
just in case,
Adorno,
let's get an
for
army
example,
in.
or Horkheimer. But
Maybe
it could also have been Walter Benjamin. I think Walter Benjamin can be an avenue into theory for people. So we have critical theory on the one hand.
can get an
which
army in 3
essentially,
turns.
to very briefly give
Perhaps.
a simplified introduction, critical theory emerges against the backdrop of a growing disillusion with orthodox Marxism, and specifically
Okay,
with the
large
political
army, yes,
application
no.
or misapplication, if
We
you
have a
will,
lot of units,
Marxism
so it
in the
might be good.
Soviet Union. And this kind of goes in two
Ooh,
directions. On the one hand, we have like
this
Sartrean
guy.
existentialism, which doesn't really engage
defending
with Marxism, but
against.
simply goes
This
in a
is
completely different
kind
direction.
of a shit balance of
And
power
argues
though.
that, you know, the central ethical
sure.
category is that the subject, after the death of God, must choose his own existence and will his own fate. That's one direction. Another
Ooh,
direction
infernal
is
cannon.
phenomenology, which essentially becomes a version of structuralist linguistics, which is to read the world as a text, but also to look at the way in which reality is structured like a language. Again, that would be deserving of a whole nother lecture. Structuralism also then goes into Lacanian psychoanalysis, which is in many ways a structuralist reworking of the principles of Freudian psychoanalysis. Critical theory, which emerges as a school of sorts dedicated to the critical reworking or understanding of power relations in post-war Europe and the United States, seen through a not Marxist lens, but if you will, post-Marxist lens, which is to say it's not simply the application of Marxist concepts and theory to reality, but rather the identification of ideological currents within
Let's go
supposedly
against
non-Marxist
Chaos Trolls or
This is also why
against
Adorno's Minima Moralia, which is essentially
this guy,
short
maybe.
reflections and aphoristic stances on contemporary life, he
Let's get
has the
rid of the
subtitle Reflections
Lord.
on Damaged Life. And so critical theory emerges as a body of thought that
Ooh,
essentially
these
is
are starting
engaged
to
in
fire.
the
Okay, cool.
idea of a critique of ideology that could go beyond orthodox Marxism.
Can we take
There's a lot
these
more to discuss
and
here,
just
especially about the ways in which the front
aim at
school
the
then
hell
was able to
cannon?
work in the United States as exiles during World War II and afterwards, but that's for another video.
Nice, no hits.
Now, critical theory is still very much its own Germanic movement, if you will.
No!
And French theory goes in a very different direction,
I
as
hate.
I've already indicated. So French post-war thought develops in terms of existentialism, which I wouldn't even really call theory, but we could sort of include here as a symptomatic response to the shortcomings of Marxism, or orthodox Marxism. Then we have phenomenology. Then we have Lacanian psychoanalysis. And through this emerges what you may have heard of before, deconstructionism. And deconstructionism blows open theory and post-war thought, which is to say, it's another revolution within a revolution. And deconstructionism is often thrown around as this incredibly abstract term that can be applied to anything, but the very basic, if you will,
Why is
formula
this
for
guy
deconstructionism is to go
not getting
back
hit?
to, is derived from Derrida and Derrida's use of binary categories. However, it's very important to note, before people get mad, that Derrida didn't think of himself as a deconstructionist, that he also did not in any way advocate for a simple formula that could be applied. And here's one of the caveats when it comes to theory. Theory also became part of what you might call the professionalization of philosophy and post-war theory within the academy, within the university system, which is to say people started specializing in specific types of thought and then taking it as if it were this doctrine that could be applied to things. So you take Derrida's writing, you call it deconstructionism, you turn it into
He got hit,
this
but it
trope
was
of binary
not a real hit.
opposites that can be read against each other, and then you start applying it to everything. You apply it to film and to books and to blah. And before you know it, you've created this very, if you will, narrow-minded community of people who have to defend their own way of looking at the world because it's become part of their professional identity and it's tied to their own power within the university system. Of course, this can continue ad nauseum. You could do a deconstruction of the neoliberal university, etc., right? In fact, when I was in university, cultural studies had become a dominant force. And cultural studies was sort of this relatively abstract term for a school of thought that increasingly
maybe?
was taking
Or
some
Giant,
critical theory, some
or
deconstructionism, and applying it to various other forms of pop culture.
let's get
So
rid of the
anything could be
Lord
analyzed,
if we
which is
can.
quite exciting, but also had its limitations. Now, what I haven't covered here, it's a lot to fit in, and sorry if I'm not being very concise. What I haven't covered here is that deconstructionism also leads to an explosion of thought as to what theory can actually be. Because if you can read the world like a text, if you can critique the ideology of what exists as given, if you've moved beyond orthodox Marxism, then suddenly you can have all these different specializations.
Okay, let's
And this
get
is where we
rid
start
of
seeing
maybe
in
the
the 1960s
Chaos
especially, but
Knights.
also in the 70s, 80s, 90s, early aughts, the development of feminist theory, the development of race theory, the development of post-colonial theory, the development of literary theory, the development of film theory, the development of art theory, the development then of terrorism theory and legal theory. And this explosion meant that suddenly philosophy not only had left the philosophy departments, nor had it simply moved into the small schools of Frankfurt School critical theory, but suddenly it went everywhere. Its tentacles were going into every department.
Hit
Every department
points,
started having a
leadership,
theory program. And this is where you start
vigor.
seeing some of the
Cool.
right-wing backlash. The idea of quote-unquote cultural Marxism, they've infiltrated our universities, etc., can be traced back specifically to the expansion of post-war critical thought
Cool.
and the critique of ideology that therefore find its way into almost every discipline. Because, of course, as soon as you start critiquing ideology and power structures, well, one of them is the university system and the way in which knowledge is accumulated and delivered to us. Now, this is not to defend it nor to attack it, but we reach peak theory, if you will,
Ooh, ouch.
at around the mid-2000s, 2010s, in which there's a theory program for everything, and it's becoming a little bit watered down, not always, but sometimes, and certain buzzwords get thrown around. Like, suddenly everyone wants to do a discursive analysis of X. In fact, so much so that we almost go full circle, that some of the terms come up in situations where they mean something completely different. Like if you're in a comparative politics seminar and someone talks about discourse analysis, they may not even mean Foucauldian discourse, namely the power structures and mechanisms that structure the way in which we articulate ideas and thought categories, and therein how we think of ourselves. No, it's specifically the discursive patterns of parliamentary speech, etc. And so theory buzzwords start finding their way into other disciplines and are actually almost neutered into something that is no longer theoretical. Peak theory. And if you want to go to specific conferences or get a paper published, etc., you need to use certain buzzwords that indicate a certain theoretical alignment, because the people on the panels all are in one camp or another, and they will pick up on your little signals that you're sending to them that will then make them be aligned with you. And so theory becomes this weirdly territorial thing, which I think is actually sort of... I've given you this.
I should have tried the
How can you get into
cool
theory?
formation this
And
time.
what does that even mean? So, for me, getting into theory in a way that felt productive actually came through reading the work of Slavoj Žižek. Because one of the interesting things that Žižek does that he doesn't really get enough credit for, I think, is that he took theory, but he also kind of plugged it back into an old school, if you will, metaphysical philosophical system. Which is to say, Žižek's Hegelianism, fused with his Lacanianism, is a way of being both a theorist, namely, he applies Lacanian psychoanalysis to film and politics and other types of cultural analysis, but at the same time it serves the project of going back to Hegel and through Hegel examining Marx differently. Which to say, Žižek actually accomplishes something quite fruitful, although we could debate the extent to which he actually accomplishes it, which is to say, what if theory isn't simply the application of this
Can we attack
ever-expanding
Chaos
post-Marxist
Warhounds?
discourse
Maybe?
to reality? What if we can actually go back to the most important
Or
ontological, philosophical questions?
these.
I.e., what if we go back to this moment of the Hegelian explosion using theory, but without simply applying theory? And I think this is actually super important. Like, Žižek doesn't apply concepts to X. He uses X, like films, etc., to then draw out new consequences from within the theory and within the philosophy, which is an inversion of sorts. And here you can see another thinker who kind of accomplishes this, which is Alain Badiou. Alain Badiou is very different from Žižek, but he's also a systematizer, a world builder, an old school philosopher, if you will. And so I think that to me, where philosophy became interesting again was when I started seeing how theory could be reconciled with the age-old philosophical problems. Because now your reading can go in two directions. You can start reading more theory, and more political theory and cultural theory and the stuff that feels very relevant to our day-to-day existence. But then you can go also backwards, and you can start reading philosophy step by step. You can start reading Hegel, and then you can start reading some Kant and Fichte and Schelling, and you could work your way all the way back. And even those philosophers who don't really fit into the tradition of that problematic, like
Let's do this.
Schopenhauer or Kierkegaard, or even Nietzsche, are nevertheless very interesting because you can see them through that lens. And now you're reading bifurcates. You start reading in a theoretical direction, and you start reading in a philosophical direction. And that's when new ideas come, I think. And so in that way, you can reconcile a philosophical interest, because if you just read philosophy texts by themselves, they can be very dry. And you can reconcile what I think is one of the problems with theoretical texts, which is that it's just about throwing around theory and applying it to everything. Like you'll see at certain art galleries where they just love to sprinkle a bit of theories over their texts. You can reconcile those two, and you can go back to what feels like a really engaged attitude towards both philosophical and theoretical problems. And that's Hegel's whole point. Like, Hegel's basic point is that you are lucky to be alive because the problems of our current reality can only be analyzed and thought by you. Like, it's kind of obvious. Hegel could only think what was happening in his time. He couldn't anticipate what was going to happen now. And so suddenly you realize that by reading and applying thought to the world around you, you are actually living the richest possible life. That being alive now is an opportunity to think things and to make connections that other people, even the brightest people, couldn't have done because they weren't alive. And to my mind, there's something very exciting about that, because when you feel interested in the world, it means you're not despairing. It means you're not feeling passive and impotent. It means that you actually have a lens, a framework to want to engage with the world. And that's why my final pitch would be to say that theory can be a community building exercise. That reading theory and using it as a gateway into philosophy can be a way of connecting with other people. Like other people who share the same interest. Because if you're into theory and you talk to someone who isn't into theory, it can be a little overwhelming. It's like any specialized interest. If I talk about basketball to somebody who loves soccer, they'll be like,
let's
yeah,
do
but
this.
why? Or if you talk about
This
Pokemon
flank is
to
really
somebody who's
strong
really into something
with
else,
us.
they'll be like, why? And so if
This
you get into
flank,
theory, I would
strong
encourage
enough,
you
I
to
guess.
read theory with other people. To have a little book group, or once a week to get a beer or a coffee.
They
and to
did get
discuss it
through,
together,
which
to take notes,
sucks.
to write out your own thoughts.
And the Dragon Ogres
Maybe even to follow my
are
lectures or be a part of our learning community on
Yeah.
Patreon. Like at the end
a
of the
bit
day, the
too
reason I
strong,
started this channel
but
was simply because during the pandemic, I
guess we can run.
wanted to talk to other people about theory because I was losing my mind, and I felt like if I didn't have an opportunity to engage in theory and philosophy, I would not be able to make it through. And so this has been a long-winded way of saying, I hope that this encourages you to get into theory, to explore some texts. Look at Verso. Verso is a publisher that has lots of theory. Look for something that interests you and just pick it up and allow yourself to be a little bit bewildered. You don't have to understand everything on the first read-through. See it as the opening in like the opening chapter in a world-building exercise. It's like in a video game when you're in a level where you don't have the powers yet to open certain doors, but then you go through the whole game, like I think it's like in Zelda, for example, and you acquire new powers, and now you can go back to the original levels and open all these doors. That's what reading theory and philosophy can be like. It's like you're gonna acquire
that's
more
quite
knowledge,
cravenly, that's
and then
for
you can loop back around to
sure.
the text that you didn't fully understand, and then you start making new connections. And that's so enriching and so thrilling that I really want you to have that opportunity in your life. That would make me very happy if this video encourages you to pick up some theory or some reading, and hopefully to also feel like it does something beneficial for you. All right. Thank you so much. I appreciate you guys. I'm going to host a bonus discussion on Discord in about 5 minutes. We're going to talk a little bit more. And I'm going to answer some of your questions. If you'd like to be a part of our
Come
learning
on.
and go a little bit deeper in your understanding of philosophy and theory, please do consider becoming a patron. There's a link in my description, or go to www.patreon.com/ I never know what it is, / Julian Philosophy. That's patreon.com / Julian Philosophy. Enjoy your reading, and I will see you next week. Bye-bye.
These guys are getting beat up.
Julian, and welcome to the Monday morning Introduction to Philosophy and Theory live stream lecture.
Today I would like to discuss Frederick
Summoners
James's
of
book,
Rage
The
are a
Beast
bit
of
too
Fury,
strong, to be
which
honest.
is a really good introduction.
Maybe let's try to help
what he
these guys
calls
out.
the French philosophical moment. Movement of various thinkers that Sartre, existentialism, but that eventually finds its way into phenomenon, semiotics, structuralism, post-structuralism, modernism, what Jameson deems the end of philosophy. And what I'd like to do in this short lecture is give you a simple and accessible introduction to some of the arguments that he lays out in the opening chapter, the introduction. I should also say that this is an unusual and highly readable book in that it is a collection of lectures that he gave, seminars toward the end of his life, transcripts of what he might call a pandemic project in which he lays out the parameters of post-war French.
Ooh, what's this?
I know that we've had some
What
issues
a
with the
spell.
internet as of late, so fingers crossed that we can get through an entire lecture. Just to be safe, I am also recording this to a microphone, which means that I can post it to Patreon. If you'd like to become a patron, you can access a bonus seminar that I record live on Discord and post an audio file and answer some of the questions for some of these. You can also get the edited transcripts for all of my lectures, the audio downloads for each one of the lectures, as well as an ongoing ebook series, which I summarize and explore further in said lectures. All of which is to say, I'm so happy to be back. I'm glad that you are here with me at this point. It feels like a classroom that belongs to me.
No!
If you'd like to support this channel, and if you'd like to go further in your learning, please do consider becoming a patron. Now, what I'd like to do today... Oh, and one more thing. I was re-watching one of my lectures, which I never do, because it's frightful to me to see myself on camera. But I was re-watching one of my lectures to see where the audio had glitched. And it suddenly occurred to me that amidst this lecture, there were ad breaks, interruptions, which is horrible. And it suddenly dawned on me just how much you guys have had to put up with. So starting today, I'm going to get rid of all of the ads on these live stream lectures. No more ads. I apologize for the latest issues. So hopefully you can enjoy this entire lectures ad-free. That seems important.
These guys seem to
Okay, let's
be the issue.
So the book's called The Years
Summoners
of
of
Fury,
Rage.
Post-War French Thought to the Present by Frederick
Maybe let's
Jameson.
get rid of them,
And
if we
you're
can,
unfamiliar with Frederick
at all.
Jameson, I posted a lecture a while back, shortly after his passing, in which I laid out his well-known...
Whoa. That's a bit too much.
But what I'd like to do is I'd like to... First of all, the task of philosophy is examination of problems. Which is to say, philosophy is not
Still
just
12.
about ideas as such. It's not just about human thought. It's about specific problematics. What in French, the same word that's in French, is that kind of problématique. And for example, if you think about Foucault doesn't simply write about the body or philosophy or wisdom.
No, these guys are a threat.
Foucault examines what you might call power structures. In other words, not how to acquire power, but the manner in which power tacitly...
Are we actually losing? I need to redo this battle.
Here we can see a philosophical problem with the problem of power changing over time. For Aristotle, the question is how is power to be used appropriately? Whereas within post-structuralism, for example, Foucault, the question becomes how is power something that we don't always experience? Okay, but let me take a step back and explain another one of Jameson's arguments. I think this is actually a really important one, especially if you're a beginning student. He says, strictly speaking, we shouldn't think of the history of philosophy as a linear trajectory. In other words, it's not the best thoughts
thought up by the grading minds. It's not a Bertrand Russell-style reduction of the history of Western philosophy, in which we can pick and choose and take some ideas that we think are worth retaining and rejecting others. Trash can in history. Instead, James believes that
These guys, yeah, I need to take care of them first, probably, whenever I'm playing again.
such moments. The first philosophical moment, the explosion of philosophy, if you will, is the movement that takes place between the discussion between Parmenides and Socrates, and subsequently between Socrates and Plato. And Plato and Aristotle. Between Socrates and Aristotle, we have essentially two foundational movements within Western philosophy. That which would become Neoplatonism, and that which would become Aristotelianism, and eventually a metaphysical rationalist approach to the world. And to simplify somewhat, Plato and Aristotle have very differing worldviews. In fact, you could even make the argument that Aristotle's
Losing
was
heavily.
a counter-movement to Plato's idea of the gymnasium. But again, to simplify somewhat, the problem that Plato is preoccupied with is the problem
I should not have
of the ideal.
targeted
truth.
that guy at
In other
all.
words, it's a fundamentally metaphysical project, a system above all, a system of metaphysics. Aristotle's approach, on the other hand, is much more engaged with the idea of teleological problems. In other words, what is something for? If you want to make a very strict binary here, which is somewhat misleading but perhaps helpful, you say that Plato is interested in ontology and in the nature of what something is. And Aristotle's interested in what purpose something serves, namely, what is it for? Teleology.
Okay.
Where is it heading? Now, to give you a little preview of
Think
where we're
I'll
going,
need to
one of
reload
Hegel's
this
innovations
thing.
is essentially to turn teleology
Loss is only like less than 1k, and I have
So here
like
we have the first
2k.
philosophical moment, according to
Yeah.
Jameson, the explosion of philosophy, which is, of course, also a reaction to sophism. One of the things that outraged Plato, and we should believe Socrates, about the sophists was precisely that they were not systematizers, that they weren't interested in any system of philosophy, that they weren't even interested in problems of philosophy, if you put it that way. They were interested in the idea of philosophy in the world.
What
Aristotle
result?
is the continuation
Nice.
of other by other means of the period. Aristotle himself was a great systematizer, except not one of ideals, but one who examines the world around them and begins to place them in taxonomical categories, and also introduces what are essentially the formal ways of looking at the world, formal and normative, meaning that they correspond to attributes which are then deemed to be either virtuous or not virtuous, just or not just, etc. Now here we have the explosion of
why
philosophy
not?
in its earliest moment, Western philosophy that is. The second philosophical
Yeah, unreliable.
much
Lol.
later. Which is to say, philosophy essentially goes to sleep. It exists, but it's still a ripple effect of Neoplatonism and Aristotelianism. Simone Weil once wrote in her diaries that ultimately she always
The
wanted to know which
ever-chosen
camp people
himself,
were the
Archeon,
Aristotelians
has
or
been
were the
sighted.
Platonists.
He leads a host
Even
of
today, you can
immeasurable
see some of
power.
those resonances
Do
where
not face him
much
in
of
battle
Anglican
unprepared.
philosophy and sort of the kind of philosophy that goes with logic tends to be Aristotelian.
We are not unprepared. We will just take care of the guy.
Origins. But the second explosion of philosophy occurs
Easy.
Fichte, or I should perhaps say Kant, Fichte, Schelling, Hölderlin, which I think we can include here, as well as Hegel. And this is truly an explosion that is also about proximity, because much of this takes place, apart from Kant, of course, in Vienna.
I think we can all resolve this.
Hegel and Schelling are roommates. Schelling is friends with Hölderlin, who also
Nice.
etc. We have here an explosion of philosophical creativity. And once again, it's about the exploration of problems. What Kant essentially does is that he's interested in the problem of essences and how we might see them or think them. Which is to say, Kant essentially applies a critical, or if you will, empirical attitude towards the problems or categories of reason as such. I've mentioned this before, but I also will say it again. The critique of pure reason essentially articulates a paradox of sorts, which is how can the idea of essence be conceived of?
Speed
if the very act
or
of conceiving
upkeep
it,
or
like
experience.
reason, already renders it into a concept, therefore being no longer essential. I.e., is it possible by reason? In other words, he tries to use reason
So we need to
get
go
rid
to...
of reason, which he conceives of as a kind of metaphysical barrier to essence.
Ready?
Can we take the
There's more
Fane
that
and
Kant
just like
does.
run?
Please do consider going back to some of my other introductory lectures on Kant. The point here is that Kant ushers
A
in
wise
a
plan.
new problematic that's so exciting in its consequences that it challenges an entire generation of thinkers to come up with their own attitudes towards it. Now, Fichte is perhaps today not so well known, but in his time was an absolute
Summon me
phenomenon,
if you dare.
hugely popular. And
Yes.
essentially the Kantian
did lose a
problematic
bunch of units,
are
I
two
see.
extreme responses.
To war.
Either we have the Fichtean response, which goes into complete idealization of the subjective, which to say, Fichte basically says the subject posits itself and thereby reality, which means that the subject is itself essence refracted. The Ich-Philosophie, which at the time was so popular that even Goethe, who spent much of his time in Vienna surrounded by many thinkers, would sign off his letters to
glory
Goethe
for the
and say
ancestors.
the I who is positing itself. Very, very popular idea. You could call it, if you will, the existentialism of the German Romantic moment. But this was contrasted with another romantic response, and yet one which is completely juxtaposed to it, which is that the Shah, the actualization of nature as a kind of substance, as a kind of ontologically
Okay, cool.
sealed off natural absolute to which the subject has
So
only
there's an
limited
army
access,
here. They
which is,
might
a
want
mysticism
to
of sorts. In fact, one of the ironic things for me
recuperate,
is that Hegel
and then
is
we're
often
ready to
characterized
battle
as a
more.
mystic thinker, when Hegel was actually responding quite
Let's
rationally
do the Slayer thing.
in comparison to his peers to the idealization of Fichtean subjectivism and the idealization of Schellingian romanticism. But that's for another time. So here we have the second explosion, the second moment of philosophical thought.
Nice, more money, all is good.
Critique of pure reason, and the responses to it, including Kant's responses to it,
Cool.
I should say. He never really got over the problem he himself had introduced. And so we have Fichte, we have Schelling,
We have runes, we
Hegel,
have whatever this is, damping.
Hegel. And Hegel becomes
we
sort
could
of
do
like
that.
the climactic figure of this entire movement. We could also add Novalis to this movement as well, but he's perhaps less related
Toppa
to Kant,
guy.
problematic here, and more closely to the Romantics as such. Of course, after Hegel, we have an entire ripple effect itself. We have the sort of the Hegelians, the new Hegelians,
I guess.
Feuerbach, who essentially applies like a theological application of Hegelianism. And one of the things that James argues is that this sort of culminates in
Okay, so
Schopenhauer,
we're missing a Fane, but I think this is still
themselves
doable.
to Hegel, in as much as they reject him. I would personally also add Kierkegaard to this moment, because I think Kierkegaard, Schopenhauer, and Nietzsche sort of function as these ripple figures who kind of demarcate a certain line. And of course, we would be amiss to be talking about the influences of Hegel without mentioning the most influential Hegelian
let's be here.
himself, namely Karl Marx. But there we're already getting ahead of ourselves. So the second philosophical moment, if you will, is this moment of the explosion of German idealism and romanticism. In fact,
Let
it's
us
often
hit
joked that what
the Feral
Germans
Manticore,
lacked
maybe?
in political revolutions,
these guys?
at least compared to the French, they made up for by means of
sure.
philosophical revolutions, German idealism. Now, the third, and this is really the crux of Jameson's argument, the third philosophical moment, explosion of philosophical thought, occurs in France after World War II, the mid-40s.
Let's go.
In the 1950s. This is what Jameson refers to as les époques glorieuses. And his argument here, and I want to be careful with my words. His argument isn't so much that the 1950s in France constitutes an explosion of philosophical thought, but rather that they announce an explosion of philosophical problems, which is to say, strictly speaking,
Iceborne marauders need to diet.
The moment of antiquity and the moment
Nice.
of idealism are nevertheless moments that are systems. These are great moments in which philosophy becomes highly formalized. And yet
What the hell is that?
In 1950s and 60s France,
Is that this
is
Warhammer?
that philosophy is opened up. It breaks. It's like a river that breaks its banks.
What the hell?
In fact, there's
What the hell was
there's a joke
hitting
that he
me?
mentions in which Sartre and Beauvoir are in a cafe where they would work and entertain guests, etc. And someone comes in and they tell them about phenomenology. And Sartre says, "Well, what's phenomenology about? What does it do?" And the guest says, "Well, you could have a theory of the beer sitting in front of you right now, and you have to open up to philosophy." Suddenly, philosophy is applicable
Nice.
to things in our daily life. It's essentially the philosophical and critical examination of the everyday. And here we have an explosion of philosophical applicability, namely the idea
Let's take care of the
that
mammoth.
everything in your day is governed either by structural linguistic systems or patterns of more overt power and also exploitation. In other words, philosophy becomes critical. It becomes theoretical. We have essentially the
And the
emergence
Manticore.
of a modernist philosophical turn, by which philosophy becomes not just applicable to one's daily life, but in that sense deeply critical of the status quo of the powers that be. And it's worth pointing out that philosophy up until then had been essentially conservative, which is to say, if you go back to Plato and Aristotle, but also the German idealists, the task of philosophy was the articulation of problems, but ultimately ones that were supposed to serve the public and the common good, and various abstract notions thereof. The French philosophical changes this. Suddenly the point of philosophy is to philosophize everything. Of course, we see this coming full circle in what Bourdieu later calls the end of philosophy, namely how everything has become philosophy. The philosophy of cats, the philosophy of motorbikes, the philosophy of cooking, etc. This universalization of the philosophy of is actually a tacitly reductionist stance that reduces philosophy back to its non-critical, supplementary nature. The French philosophical movement,
Nice.
on the other hand,
Mammoth is
emphasizes
fleeing.
the philosophy of cooking wouldn't be about how you can apply Zen habits to cooking, but would be about investigating the colonial and power structures that go into the process by which food finds its way onto your table and the signifiers of codification of what meals you make, etc. It's an explosion of critical creativity, if you will. And so one of Jameson's goals in this book, which I will not do here myself, is to essentially lay out this trajectory of development of French thought. And he says that the catalyst for this movement is Sartre's economics. And when I read that, I thought it was kind of interesting, actually, because so much of French philosophical thought, as we know it, etc., is actually a reaction against Sartrean existentialism. Because Sartrean existentialism very much steps aside from the continuation of philosophy, the alienism of Marxism. And now we can get back to the unnamed character. One of the important things to note about Karl Marx is that even though he's a Hegelian, he also ushers in what you might call the end of philosophy. Which is to say, one of the things that happens within the 19th century is that various philosophical positions emerge that take place outside the realm of philosophy and such. For example, Marx, its work is in the realm of political economy, and what you might even refer to as a sort of grand narrative societal critique. This isn't to say that Hegel wasn't interested in culture and religion and art, etc., but Marx is creating a system that specifically rejects the idea of idealist philosophical systems and seeks to quote-unquote ground it in materialism and a theory of political economy to render philosophy but we have against this movement also the emergence of psychoanalysis. Psychoanalysis used to do something very similar, which is to say the essentially modern measure of psychoanalysis is that it is philosophy by other means. It's investigating the so-called structure of the unconscious, the subject of the unconscious.
Okay.
In other words, here we have two investigations that derive from the Hegelian problematic. Remember that I said that Hegel essentially turned ontology or teleology into ontology. It's not about the essence of things or about the purpose or the form. Instead, to understand the essence is to understand what they are for, where they are going. In other words,
no.
we have here an essentially
Don't die,
historicist
please.
kernel that finds its way into philosophy, namely the examination
Dragrult.
of the
What
present
the fudge
and
is a
the historical,
Dragrult?
socio-political context in which thought takes place. Here we have perhaps the ideal Aristotelian Hegelian notion of thought thinking itself. Marx's inquiry into
No.
is a process of understanding problems in a way that their terms cannot be told. Psychoanalysis is the emergence of a movement that seeks to problematize
Okay, we die, I think.
experience
We
of
die, I think,
consciousness
pretty
in a way
hard.
that has not been done before, and this is crucial, could only have been done against the backdrop of the emergence of emergent modern consciousness. In other words, within psychoanalysis and the emergence of Marxism, we already have the emergence of the anti-philosophical stance, or perhaps more precisely,
Nice.
the continuation of philosophy by other means. Excuse me. Hegel's dialectic, Hegel's phenomenology of spirit, essentially declares the end of philosophy, because it's the end of the essentialist dialectic system of philosophy as such. And so the emergence of Freudian psychoanalysis, Marxism, economy, essentially already creates a very fertile soil against which
I think I messed up my canon more than anything else.
And this moment of French theory, therefore, is once again anti-philosophical. Hegelian psychoanalysis, which is deeply
Okay, let's
embedded
get rid of the feral manticore, maybe, as a final thing we do.
Syrian linguistics, phenomenology, even structuralism. These are anti-philosophical movements, and that fundamentally they're not seeking to lay out a system as such, nor are they interested in the inquiry into metaphysical essences or truth. In fact, they entirely reject this. Instead, they focus on subjective things, on the creation of the subject, the body, by means of speech, by means of actions, by means
Nice.
of will. And here again, we can see the ripple effects of Schopenhauer and Nietzsche. In fact, existentialism would be unimaginable without Nietzsche.
Can we get one hit in?
Now, what I'd like to do here to conclude briefly is I'd like to briefly introduce the problem,
No?
if you will, of postmodernism. And Frederick Jameson makes the somewhat controversial, but I think understandable argument that postmodernism is both the end of philosophy and the
Come on.
emergence of what you might call an American.
Okay, I guess. Ah, nice. Gotcha.
And he traces the emergence of postmodernism
Yeah, cool.
back to the French thinkers, including, for example, Deleuze, who says it's
Did this guy die?
it moves away
No.
from the modernist problematics into those of the postmodern.
But the reason that he calls it an American political moment is that postmodernism is a form of thought that is also distinctly suited to the emergence of the American articulation.
We lost a lot of units.
Meaning, which is to say, it is fractal, it is meta-referential.
I guess we need to just run.
Both could not exist without theory.
Okay, we're gonna reload.
And yet also dissolves it to some extent. Which is to say, the logical conclusion of the French philosophical moment, the opening up of philosophy, is also that fundamentally philosophy can be anything. You can write the philosophy of music, you can write the philosophy of agriculture, philosophy of medicine. And so this very opening up of philosophy also means that philosophy becomes detached from some of its problematics. It becomes detached from its traditions. And in this sense, postmodern thought represents the very same detachedness that occurs within the production of art, within the modification of culture, within the self.
He's in a stance. Okay, gotcha. Then let's not be in a stance.
In other words, we have a risky moment in which philosophy becomes itself simply another lifestyle passage. You can choose your own philosophy. You can be whatever philosophy you want to be.
Conrad. Okay, cool.
This is my own.
Guess I need to fight this battle.
People who say that they are stoicists and who subscribe to Stoic philosophy or the so-called Nietzsche bros, etc., are essentially following a postmodern impulse, which the idea that philosophy is this all-you-can-eat buffet from which you can choose whichever dish
Once
you like
more,
best, and then
we will
gorge yourself
ally with
on
the
it.
manlings,
This idea
just
that
as
philosophical
Grimnir
moments
did
can be
10
chosen at
score
random,
centuries ago.
according to the logic
It
of
has
which
been
is best
many
applicable to
years
you and your
since
life,
the Umgeir
is
produced an
postmodern
emperor
idea.
as worthy as
Actually not
Magnus
going back
or
to
their
the
founding
classics.
warrior
It's a
king.
distinctly postmodern
But
attitude
I hear
towards
good things
philosophical
about this France.
self-justification.
Now
One
is
which,
the time to
once
test
again,
his mettle.
characteristically
We will
postmodern
stand
fashion,
with him against the
displays
Grovey
itself as
at
being
Blackfire
anti-postmodern.
Pass, as King
Here we have
Kurgan did
a
long
snake
ago.
eating its own tail.
Cool.
If the men of the Empire fight with bravery and honor, then the runes of my crown will glow with pride ever after. A gesture of my will, just as this Emperor awaits to take up his Warhammer. A gift from the Dwarves, no less.
But in a way that
So,
goes through
gird your
postmodernism,
loins, my
not
kid.
beyond
He does blabber a lot.
postmodern becomes
And
this
thirsty for
eternal
Urk
loop,
blood,
but
for
how do we
they
go
call.
through its very problem?
We will
In other words,
repulse
how do we
these
find
vile
the
creatures
post-postmodern
with our
moment,
dying breath
moment of
and renew
metamodernism?
the oldest and greatest
And perhaps
alliance
our
this world has ever
contemporary
seen.
The world.
Put it in Adornian terms, which is to say the reorientation.
Okay, I guess we need to not run up there initially. Let's be in the corner.
And my hope is that these lectures contribute to such an understanding,
Like this?
but also invite you
Maybe.
into the process of reading philosophy yourself. On which note, I would like to conclude by saying that
Foe
James's mission
spike.
here is to essentially lay out the field. It's an invitation for people to study philosophy.
Can we get
themselves.
rid of the
The basic project,
wolf riders
I
first?
fully agree with, and which is very instructive in my own thinking, has been very instructive in my own thinking, is that in order to really engage with philosophy, one has to understand the connection between different philosophical moments and thinkers. And so this is not a history of the best of human thought, which would be a vulgar characterization of philosophy, I believe. But instead, it's a very gentle and accessible introduction to the way in which philosophical moments and to that end,
Nice. The hit did not do much though.
what he calls the years of theory. We can talk more about this in the seminar, but I will report after this.
That was the wrong target to choose, I think.
Thank you so much for being here this morning. I see that there are currently 53 people, which is utterly remarkable. So thank you so much. If you'd like to go a little deeper into
Ooh,
patron, but otherwise
Doom Diver.
simply stay around.
Whatevs.
I'm very bad at information. Stick around and hope to see you next Monday. Thank you so much, and I will see you soon.
So right now we just have our regular. Can I get a second
Can we get another one? You
Oh
can.
man,
Perfect. That's 2 ranged guys.
all bowed up on a Thursday afternoon.
Can we get another? Yeah, can we get another? Can we try upgrading one of our other ones, maybe? Nope.
What are you doing though?
Same.
Nope. Dang.
Get back here.
This is the kind of thing you got to come back to later.
Yeah.
As you get stuff, as you upgrade, as you come through the game.
Get more tender meat.
Yeah. Ooh. Well, let's just make it as big as we can. We have time for one more level probably. So let's try and get as stacked as we can.
Yeah, but get a big army.
Yeah.
The bigger the army, the stronger the pad is.
Yep. The bigger the pond, the pawner the pond.
That's what it is.
Yep.
The bigger the Don, the bigger the Chaka.
That's right. A noble death.
Oh, that is so ominous.
Who let these Carmens erect this fortress in Neokiri Swamp? They're right in the way of my determined Patapon. I'll have to destroy it. I don't have a choice. Get my Unipons. Do I have any upgrades for my Unipons? I have the Friendship Bow and the Firebow.
Firebow.
man.
Oh, they are.
You can tell that one's a Firebow because it's got that orange.
It's oranged up.
It's so hot right now. Oh, we got another Iron Spear. Oh, this guy has a bigger hat. Congratulations on your Iron Hat.
It's optimized. It's just so fast. It's so easy.
Yeah.
Shuba.
Yes.
Oh, so
Mandling
different
side.
tasks.
The
Okay,
power
cool.
of rapid attack. The hurt will fall like rain.
But the damage will be minimal. You got it. There's some drawbacks.
Here we go. Let's see how it goes. Can Biff pull us through this final? Oh, that's a big
tower, but I think with your additional numbers, I think you will be able to, pat upon your way through this. I see you made it. Give me a second, Tim.
the power of the Supreme Patapon.
This is what I think of that. Ah! Oh, he has a sight. This is a cool one.
Yeah, why do I get this cool guy?
Can you join our team?
I'd like to subscribe to your team instead.
Lord Gong. That is the name. Lord Gong, we wish to fight with you. Ah, it's his name.
Gong gang. Gang gong gong.
Gang gang.
Gang gang gong.
He's died once.
I was being too silly, I dropped my combo.
It's okay, I feel like it's a lot easier to get fever in this game than it was in the
Okay, can we do this?
I think we were able to.
What are these guys doing?
So fast. And there's a little cannon on it.
I see how they erected the whatever, I don't even know.
Oh, big swing. Boom. Gotta love that. Thank you, Biff, the hero Patapon.
Yep.
Dang, someone's got range. Someone is throwing those so far.
It's probably my Unipons with the bows.
Oh, not even throwing. You're just using arrows. Definitely fire. Oh, there's one right through it, yeah. Another big tower. Hopefully, Biff. Oh, Biff
yeah.
just threw a tactical spear.
Okay, this was weird. Let's play. Green skin sided. Okay, I think we good here. Still need to fight this big guy. Ooh, nice. Spearman coming from the flank. Not bad. You get the cannons back and fire, please. Hidden foes, whatevs. Archers are kind of a problem. Flying monster is not ideal to have around, but doesn't matter as much. Ideally we'd get rid of it now? Maybe? Maybe not. Trolls are kind of trolly. Cool, they're routing. Let's hit these guys. Meow. Everyone's routing. We have this. Don't hit allies, don't hit allies. Bang. Ah, missed. Oh. Ooh, Spidey. That's not good. Okay, so Doom Divers getting taken out by Swordsman? Maybe. Nice. Actually got the hit. Let's get rid of the giant. Let's also get the cannon back. From where though? Here? Yeah, you need to check the cannon. Let's go. Nice. Nice. Okay, getting rid of the goblins would make sense. Probably won't get rid, but yeah. One hit then? Where are our cannons though? Okay. Good enough battle. Not bad. Pretty quick there. What? We're doing super good. Dragon Crown of Karaz. That's cool. Ooh. Not bad.
For the wisdom of Valea, summon me if you dare.
So we teleported away for that one moment. But it didn't work. We're still here? How? How's that a thing? Can I get a second armor of Skaldur? Why is the armor there? Okay. Okay, let's move then. We gonna march. This is 64% chaos. 70. We're gonna go here. Probably a good idea. Maybe not.
Bearers, move!
Gonna head back. Okay, ambush there. Does not matter to us at all. I'm gonna just fly away. Could do that. I think March is better, probably. Norska guys need to fall at some point.
Forwards!
Yeah, whatever. Someone would maybe help him.
Grudge bearers will.
Here?
Let us be about this. The axe thirsts for war. Aye, grudges will be settled.
Yeah, cool.
Wrong agrees.
March to Varenka.
Beards in belts.
Yeah, that's cool.
Aye.
Gonna recruit someone, maybe?
For the wisdom of the
Ah, he needs to be
the clan honor.
no stance, yeah.
Summon me
Or
if you dare.
okay, we don't have a building to recruit from. Okay, that's more horrible. In 3 turns we'll get an option though? Can't we do
The axe thirsts
global?
for war.
The garrisoned or in camp state, but I am garrisoned, no?
Reckoning. To war. What? Moving.
Okay, global. Nice. Sure, iron breakers, I guess. Or maybe longbeards? I don't know. 700, that's way too much.
Wisdom of Valea.
Okay, can we... Yeah, can we maybe recruit here? Sanguine is good. Blood feud is good. Okay, and let's recruit some stuff. I guess. In case they come and attack. These guys are almost at full health. This place kind of needs the public order, so yeah, whatevs. Four population for that. Oof, that will take some time. don't really need these buildings. I'm gonna get that cool thing in 4 turns. We could do this.
My axe thirsts for war.
And we could do this.
Glory for the ancestors. What's orders?
And this.
Moving off. Yes, let's move. Doubtful. Don't think so.
Okay, let's save. I think we're good. Okay, gonna play more next week. I'm pretty tired. Listened to a lot of weird lectures. Next time I'll just play.